Family Guy was canceled in 2002. Nobody wanted the reruns. Cartoon Network bought them for basically nothing. Then, something happened that had never happened before in television history. The audience brought it back from the dead through sheer refusal to let it go. DVD sales. Late night reruns. 3 million copies sold. Fox came back with their hat in hand and ordered 35 new episodes. That audience saved a specific show. What Fox gave them back was a different one. Early Family Guy was built from the characters out. Real people with real wants, humor that earned its laughs, a voice so specific that its creator could recognize it the moment a stranger walked into an audition room and accidentally found it. Modern Family Guy is content, background noise, 400 episodes of a machine running without the person who built it anywhere near the controls. Today I want to make the case for what the original show actually was, and trace exactly when, how, and why it stopped being that. We're going through all of it. The characters, the structure, the moment Seth MacFarlane stopped writing, and what the show became without him. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let's get into it. The cancellation that proved the show mattered. The fourth season of Family Guy opens with Peter Griffin standing in his living room making an announcement. He tells his family they have been canceled. Then he starts listing every show Fox put in their time slot while they were gone. A long, humiliating list of failures. And after running through all of them, he concludes that maybe, since every single one of those shows bombed, Family Guy might actually have a shot. The theme song kicks in, the episode starts. And in that one short opening scene, the show tells you everything you need to know about what it just survived and how strange it was that it survived at all. Family Guy first aired on January 31st, 1999. Fox gave it one of the best possible launching pads, a slot immediately after the Super Bowl, one of the most watched broadcasts in American television every single year. That premiere pulled in strong numbers. Millions of people saw the Griffins for the first time that night, and enough of them liked what they saw that Fox picked the show up for a full run. By all early signs, this was going to be fine. Then Fox started moving the show around. Season 2 got relocated to Thursday nights, where it had to compete with Frasier. That was already a tough ask. Then they moved it again. Season 3 landed on Thursdays at 8 p.m., going directly up against Friends, the most watched show on American television at the time, and a new CBS show called Survivor that was pulling in enormous audiences. Family Guy got crushed in the ratings. Not because people had stopped enjoying it, but because Fox kept putting it in places where it was impossible for it to breathe. The numbers dropped. Fox looked at those numbers and decided it was time to cut their losses. In 2002, the show was canceled for good. One episode from season 3 was left sitting in a drawer, never aired. The Griffin family was done. What happened next has no real comparison in the history of American television. Fox needed to sell the rerun rights to someone. They tried. Nobody wanted them. Cartoon Network eventually bought those rights for what the president of 20th Century Fox Television Production would later describe as basically nothing, practically free. Cartoon Network put the show in the Adult Swim late night block, which ran programming for older audiences after regular Cartoon Network kids content ended for the evening. Family Guy started airing on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. Within days, it was the highest rated show on the entire network. Viewership jumped by 239% in that time slot. People who had missed it on Fox, people who had been too young to watch it the first time around, people who had heard about it from friends, they all found it there, late at night, and they stayed. At the same time, Fox released the complete first and second seasons on DVD. Those discs went on sale the same week the Adult Swim reruns started. The timing was not planned to be a big event. It just happened that way. And what happened as a result was completely unexpected. The season 1 and 2 DVD set sold 2.2 million copies. That made it the best-selling television DVD of the entire year 2003. The second best-selling television DVD of all time up to that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. The season 3 DVD, released shortly after, sold more than 1 million copies too. People were not just watching the reruns. They were spending their own money to own the show. They were buying it, keeping it, watching it again. That does not happen with a show people only sort of like. Fox noticed. Of course they did. On May 20th, 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy, more than 2 full seasons, and brought the show back. Family Guy became the first show in television history to be brought back from cancellation based primarily on DVD sales. The season 4 premiere aired on May 1st, 2005. Nearly 12 million people watched it. Now, that story is usually told as a simple comeback story. Show gets canceled, fans stay loyal, show comes back, everyone wins. And on the surface, that is what happened. But there is something sitting underneath that story that almost never gets talked about. And it is the most important thing about why early Family Guy was different from what came after. The people who saved this show made a specific choice. They did not save it by showing up when Fox told them to. They saved it by finding it on their own, late at night, in a place nobody expected. They saved it by paying real money for DVDs at a time when buying a television show on disc was still a fairly deliberate decision. The adults who were watching Adult Swim at midnight were not casual viewers. The people spending their money on those box sets were not people who had the show on in the background while they did something else. These were people who genuinely loved what Family Guy was doing in those first 3 seasons. The actual thing, the specific version of the show, and who wanted more of it. That version of the show had a very clear identity. Early Family Guy was built around a real family going through real situations, with the jokes and the cutaway gags existing on top of that structure, not instead of it. Peter Griffin in those early seasons was stupid, yes, but he was stupid in the way that a man who genuinely loves his family and genuinely cannot see the problems he is causing is stupid. He was recognizable. Lois had her own history, a wealthy upbringing she had walked away from, real frustrations, real moments where the show let her breathe as a person rather than just react to Peter. Stewie was a genuinely dark concept played completely straight. Brian was the one person in the house who could see everything clearly and was mostly powerless to change any of it. The show had a world with actual rules, and it cared about those rules. The audience that bought those DVDs was buying that version of the show. That is the version they fell in love with. That is the version they wanted more of. What Fox saw was 12 million viewers for the season 4 premiere, strong DVD sales, a proven brand, and a built-in audience that had already demonstrated they would show up. What Fox could not fully measure was what specifically those people had been showing up for. And when the show came back, the pressure was different. The expectations were different. The show was now a proven moneymaker running on a major network in a stable Sunday time slot after The Simpsons, which is about as safe and comfortable as a show can get. That is a fundamentally different creative environment than writing for a show that keeps getting canceled and moved and ignored. MacFarlane himself acknowledged something important about what the cancellations had done to the writing staff. He said it plainly. The positive side of Family Guy constantly getting pulled off the air was that the team was always having to bring in new writers. A room that knows the show might not survive the next season writes with a certain urgency. A room that knows the show is locked in through 2028 does not write the same way. The 2005 comeback was not a clean return to what the show had been. Some of it was. The first handful of season 4 episodes still had the energy and the structure of the early run. But the incentives had shifted. The show was now a hit. Hits get managed differently than cult favorites. The specific audience, who had kept the flame alive through the cancellation years, was now sharing their show with a much larger general audience, and the show had to figure out which of those two groups it was writing for. Over time, the answer became clear. And the answer was not the people who bought the DVDs. There is a version of this story where the comeback works perfectly, where Fox brings the show back and the writers, feeling vindicated and energized, produce another 3 seasons of tight, funny, character-driven television. That did not happen. Not fully. The show came back and immediately started becoming something slightly different. Not worse on day 1, but different. The choices being made about character, about structure, about what the jokes were doing in relationship to the stories being told, those choices started moving in a new direction almost from the moment season 4 began. Some of that shift was about the show's growing ambitions. Some of it was about the pressure that comes with success. Some of it was about the changing makeup of the writer's room. And a significant part of it came down to one fact that most people who discuss this topic tend to skip over. Seth MacFarlane, who built Family Guy from scratch, who knew what every character was for and why every joke was supposed to land where it landed, he was still there for the revival. He was there for season 4 and season 5 He was still in the room. The show he made and the show that came back were at least connected by the person who created it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened when that stopped being true is a different story entirely, and it changed everything. Section 2. The showrunner handoff. What happened when MacFarlane left the room? There is a question that almost never gets asked about Family Guy, and it is probably the most important one. Not when did the show start getting worse, or which season marked the turning point. People argue about those things all the time and never land on the same answer. The more useful question is simpler. Who was actually in the room writing it? Because the answer to that question changes at a very specific moment. And when it changes, everything changes with it. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy from nothing. He did not walk into a job where someone handed him a show and asked him to run it. He built the whole thing himself. The original concept came from 2 short animated films he had made, one called The Life of Larry and one called Larry and Steve. Those shorts featured a middle-aged man named Larry and his dog Steve. MacFarlane pitched a version of that idea to Fox in 1998, received $50,000 to make a 15-minute pilot, and from that pilot came The Griffins. Peter is a redesigned version of Larry. Brian is a redesigned version of Steve. The show that became one of the longest-running animated series in American television history started as one man with one idea, pitching to a room of network executives. MacFarlane did not just create the show, he was the show, in a way that is hard to fully explain unless you look at what he was actually doing during production. He was the voice of Peter Griffin, he was the voice of Stewie Griffin, he was the voice of Brian Griffin, he was the voice of Glenn Quagmire, he voiced Tom Tucker, the news anchor, he voiced Tom Tucker's son, Jake. He voiced dozens of minor and recurring characters across the show's run. One person providing the voices of 4 of the 6 main characters and a large portion of everyone else they ever talked to. That kind of involvement does not happen at a distance. That requires being deeply inside the show, episode by episode, knowing exactly what every character is doing and why. And he was writing, too. Or more precisely, he was in every room where the writing happened, shaping every script, sitting across from every joke before it made it onto the page. The show carried his fingerprints not just on the characters, but on the specific texture of how the humor worked, the timing, the way a cutaway connected back to the scene it interrupted, the reason a joke landed at exactly the moment it did, rather than 2 seconds earlier or later. MacFarlane studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design. Before Family Guy, he had worked at Hanna-Barbera, writing for Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken. He knew technically how animation worked in a way that most television writers do not. He understood what the medium could do and what it could not. The show he built reflected all of that. Not in a showy way. You do not watch early Family Guy and think about its creator's technical knowledge, but you feel it. The jokes have a shape to them. The cutaways have a reason. The characters behave in ways that are consistent with who they were established to be. That consistency does not happen by accident. It happens because someone is holding the whole thing in their head at once, making sure the pieces fit. Now here is the part of the story that matters most. Starting with Season 4, the revival season, the one that came back after 3 years of cancellation and DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, MacFarlane handed the role of showrunner to 2 other people. David A. Goodman and Chris Sheridan became the first co-showrunners in the show's history. They were the first people to run Family Guy who were not Seth MacFarlane. He was still there, still voicing the characters, still involved at the executive level. But the day-to-day creative decisions, who was writing which episode, what direction the characters were taking, how the room was operating, those moved into other hands. That is not unusual for television. Most long-running shows go through changes in who is running them. Creators step back, bring in trusted partners, let other people carry more of the weight. What was unusual about Family Guy was how completely identified the show was with the specific mind that made it. When a show is built around one person's sense of humor, one person's understanding of the characters, one person's instincts about why a joke is funny, the departure of that person from the writing process is not just a personnel change, it is a creative transplant. The first sign of what that transplant would eventually mean came not from the show itself, but from the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike. Writers across Hollywood walked off the job in a dispute over pay and working conditions. MacFarlane supported the strike. He refused to work on the show while the strike was going on. Fox, however, kept producing. They aired 3 episodes of Family Guy without MacFarlane's approval. Episodes that went out under the show's name, carrying the show's characters, without the person who created those characters having any say in whether they were ready. MacFarlane did not stay quiet about this. In an interview with Variety, he called it a colossal dick move. He was angry. Not just as a matter of pride, but because he understood what it meant to have the show go out without him. These were not abstract characters to him. They were things he had built, voices he lived inside, a world he had constructed with very specific intentions. Having someone else send that world out without his approval was not a minor disagreement. It was a statement about who the show actually belonged to. The strike ended, production resumed, but the episode had revealed something important about the relationship between MacFarlane and the show by that point in its run. He was no longer the only gatekeeper. The machinery of Family Guy had grown large enough that it could, technically, keep moving without him. Not well. He made sure people knew he did not consider those 3 episodes to be fully his, but it could move. Then, in 2011, he stepped back further. Ted was MacFarlane's first film. He wrote it, directed it, starred in it as the voice of a living teddy bear opposite Mark Wahlberg and Mila Kunis, who herself had been the voice of Meg Griffin since season 2. Ted came out in 2012 and became a genuine hit. MacFarlane was no longer a television creator who occasionally thought about doing other things. He was someone with a film career, a music career, and multiple television projects running at the same time. He could not be the daily creative engine of Family Guy the way he had been in its early years. He did not pretend otherwise. In a Reddit conversation with fans in September 2017, he said it plainly. He had not written for Family Guy since 2010. He was still the executive producer. He was still showing up to record the voices. But the writing, the actual sentences, the actual jokes, the actual decisions about what Peter and Brian and Stewie would do and say and be, that had been someone else's job for years by the time he said it. Think about what that means in practical terms. Family Guy ran for 10 seasons between 2005 and 2017. MacFarlane was actively writing for approximately 5 of those, the first half of the revival era. The second half, the show ran without the person who invented it having any creative input beyond performing the voices of characters someone else had written lines for. He was still the face of the show. He was still the reason anyone knew who Peter Griffin was. But he was not making the decisions that determined what Peter Griffin did. The writers who were making those decisions were talented people. Steve Callahan, the most credited writer in the show's history with 19 episodes to his name, understood Family Guy as well as anyone outside MacFarlane. The writing staff across the show's revival era included people who went on to create and run other successful shows, the kind of people who do not end up in writers' rooms by accident. This was not a show being run by people who did not know what they were doing. But knowing how to write comedy and knowing how to write Family Guy specifically are not exactly the same thing. The second skill requires understanding what the show is, its actual identity, its actual rules, its actual reason for existing. That knowledge lived most completely in one person, and when that person stopped writing, it began to leak out of the show slowly, episode by episode, across years of production. MacFarlane himself had said something revealing about what the cancellations had done to the show's writing staff over the years. He noted that one of the few good things about Family Guy being pulled off the air repeatedly was that the team always had to bring in new writers. The turnover kept the room from going stale. Fresh people came in, brought new angles, kept the energy moving. But that observation cuts both ways. Constant restaffing also means constant loss of institutional knowledge, the understanding of why things work the way they work, built up through years of being in the room. A writer's room that turns over frequently never fully owns its own history. It keeps starting conversations that someone else already finished 3 seasons ago. What the show needed, and what it had in its earliest years, was a center of gravity. One person who held all of it, the history, the characters, the rules, the tone, and made sure every episode connected back to that center. MacFarlane was that person. The show he made in seasons 1 through 3 and into the early revival years has a coherence to it that later seasons simply do not. Not because the later writers were less skilled, because they were writing a show without its architect in the room to tell them when something did not feel right. There is a small detail that captures this perfectly. When MacFarlane records Brian Griffin's voice, he uses his own natural speaking voice, the only character across the entire show for which this is true. Peter, Stewie, Quagmire, all of them required MacFarlane to do something specific with his voice, to create a sound that did not naturally come out of him. Brian is the one character he just talks as. MacFarlane has said Brian is his favorite character. It is not hard to see why. Brian, in the early seasons, is the character in the show who sees everything most clearly, who feels things most honestly, who has the most genuine inner life under all the jokes. That character is the closest thing on the show to the person who made it. When MacFarlane stopped writing, Brian started changing. Not immediately, but over time in ways that will matter a great deal when we get to that part of the story. For now, the most important thing to understand is this. Family Guy was not a machine that could run itself. It was a specific creative vision that required its creator to stay close to it. When he stepped back, the show kept going. It never stopped. It never came close to stopping. But what it was doing, why it was doing it, and whether the jokes and the characters and the cutaways still had the shape and purpose they had in the beginning, those things started to drift. Slowly at first, then faster. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the place where that drift became most visible, the single element of the show that changed more than any other and made the biggest difference to how the whole thing felt, was not a character. It was a joke format. Specifically, the format that most people think of when they think of Family Guy at all. The Cutaway was supposed to be a tool. What it became is a different story. Section 3. When the Cutaway was a tool versus when it became the show. There is a moment in a Season 2 episode of Family Guy called Mind Over Murder, where Peter is stuck inside the house under a kind of home arrest and starts going crazy from boredom. He tells his family that all the television shows are starting to blur together in his head. The scene immediately cuts to something called Homicide: Life on Sesame Street, a quick joke that mashes up a gritty crime drama with a children's show, plays for about 5 seconds, and then returns to Peter sitting in his living room, going slowly out of his mind. That cutaway works. It works because it comes directly out of what Peter just said. He said the shows are blurring together. The joke shows two shows blurring together. The cutaway is not a separate thing sitting next to the episode. It is the episode expressing itself in a different form for 5 seconds before returning to the story. Pull that cutaway out and the scene loses something. It becomes just a man complaining about being bored. The cutaway is doing real work. Now think about what the cutaway gag became 20 seasons later. And the distance between those two things tells you almost everything you need to know about what changed in Family Guy and why it matters. The cutaway gag has a simple structure. A character says something that sets it up, usually a line like, "This is worse than the time I," or "Remember when?" And then the scene immediately jumps away from the main story to show a completely separate little moment, usually lasting anywhere from a few seconds to sometimes a full minute or more, before jumping back to wherever the episode actually was. That structure was not invented by Family Guy. Monty Python used versions of it. Other comedy shows had experimented with random cuts for decades. But Family Guy made it its own in a way that no other show had, and in its early seasons, it made it work in a very specific way. The key word is tool. In seasons 1 through 3, the cutaway gag was a tool inside a working machine. The machine was the episode itself, a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Characters who wanted things, situations that had consequences. The cutaway gag was one of several ways the show expressed its humor, and it sat alongside actual jokes in the dialogue, actual character behavior, and actual physical comedy happening in the scene. You could remove the cutaways from most early Family Guy episodes and still have a functioning episode. The story would still make sense, the characters would still be doing something. That stopped being true. And the show itself knows it, which is the strangest part. In a Season 10 episode called Back to the Pilot, Stewie and Brian use a time machine to go back and watch the very first episode of Family Guy, Death Has a Shadow. While they are there, the episode shows what happens during the cutaway gags from that original episode. The characters in the present, the modern versions of Stewie and Brian watching from the sidelines, are shown smoking, checking their phones,
doing their makeup. They are killing time. They are waiting for the cutaway to end so the episode can continue. The joke lands because everyone watching already knows that is what cutaways had become by Season 10. Not moments inside the story, intermissions between the moments. The show was making a joke about its own broken relationship with the gag format it had built its reputation on. Later in that same episode, a version of Peter from a dark, possible future simply announces, "Here's a cutaway," and then stands on a plain white background and says a single unfunny line. No setup, no connection to anything, just a character announcing that a cutaway is happening, and then delivering something that does not even try to be a joke. The show was not just acknowledging the problem at that point, it was putting it on screen and saying, "Look at what this became." The fact that the show could identify the problem so clearly and still not fix it is worth sitting with. That gap between knowing something is wrong and being able to correct it is one of the most telling signs that the problem was structural. It was not about one bad episode or one weak writing team. It was about the entire way the show had reorganized itself around the cutaway gag as its primary reason to exist. Here is what that reorganization looked like in practice. In the early seasons, someone in the writer's room would start with a story. Peter loses his job. Stewie builds a machine. Brian falls for a woman he cannot have. The story comes first, and then the jokes, including the cutaway gags, are found inside the story. The cutaway in Mind Over Murder exists because the story created a moment where it fit perfectly. It was not written first and then slotted into an episode that needed to use it. What changed is the order of operations. Multiple people who have analyzed the later seasons of Family Guy have described the same pattern. The writers generate banks of cutaway gag ideas and then build the loosest possible story around them as a way of connecting them together. The story becomes a container. The cutaways become the content. And because the cutaways no longer need to connect to any specific story moment to justify their existence, they stop being connected to anything. They are just things that happen. This is not a small creative shift. It is a complete reversal of how the show was originally designed. And it shows up in a very specific, measurable way. The cutaways get longer. When a cutaway is doing real work, when it earns its place by connecting to what the character just said or what the episode is doing at that moment, it does not need to run long. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The joke lands, the scene returns. But when the cutaway is no longer a tool inside a story, and instead is the story itself, it needs to fill time. It needs to be the thing the audience is watching, rather than a quick aside from the thing the audience is watching. So the gags stretch. A minute, 2 minutes, sometimes longer. And because they are stretched, they have to justify their length, which means they escalate. They keep going, keep adding, keep trying to be worth the time they are taking. Most of the time, they are not. The result is that the actual episodes, the story parts, the scenes where characters are talking to each other and something is happening, shrink. There is only so much runtime in a 22-minute episode. If the cutaways are getting longer and more frequent, something has to give. What gives is the plot. What gives is the characters having scenes together where something real happens between them. What gives is the show doing the thing that made it worth watching in the first place. There is a documented comparison that makes this stark. Someone once analyzed 3 episodes side by side. One from Season 2, one from Season 4, and one from Season 14. The Season 2 episode had actual jokes in the dialogue.
The characters were saying funny things to each other. The cutaways were extra, adding to the humor that already existed in the scene. By season 4, the balance had shifted slightly, with cutaways doing more of the heavy lifting. By season 14, the pattern had become clear. The main story had almost no jokes in it. The characters were not saying funny things to each other. The cutaways were carrying the entire comedic weight of the episode. The story existed purely to generate setups for them. The show even developed a verbal shortcut for this. The phrase, "This is worse than the time," or "This is better than the time," which a character drops into almost any conversation to justify cutting away from it. That phrase can be inserted into any moment in any episode, regardless of what is happening, which is precisely the problem. A tool that can be used anywhere is a tool that has lost its relationship to anything specific. In the early seasons, a cutaway had to be earned by the moment. In the later seasons, the phrase "remember the time" became a skeleton key that unlocked a cutaway no matter what the scene actually needed. Peter uses it when the family is having a serious conversation. Brian uses it when making a point about his own life. Stewie uses it mid-argument. The show does not ask anymore whether the moment calls for a jump away from the story, because the question has already been answered in advance. The answer is always yes. The cutaway is always welcome. The story will wait. What this does to the characters is something that does not get discussed enough. In the early seasons, the cutaway gags mostly came from Peter. He would say something, reference a memory, and the scene would show that memory. The gag was connected to Peter's perspective on the world, his specific, recognizable way of seeing things that were happening around him. The cutaway was a window into how his mind worked. That made it character work as much as it was comedy.
You learned something about Peter every time you saw where his brain went.
In later seasons, almost any character can set up a cutaway at any time. Peter sets them up, Brian sets them up, Quagmire sets them up, Stewie sets them up. Even minor characters who appear in one episode can suddenly drop a "remember when" and send the show sideways for 90 seconds. The gag stopped belonging to any particular character's voice and became a general-purpose mechanism the show pulls out whenever it needs to fill time or land a joke it could not fit into the actual episode. When a tool stops belonging to anyone specifically, it stops meaning anything specifically. The show tried to correct this at least once, in a way that became notable. In 2010, the writers produced 2 episodes with 0 cutaway gags, entirely to prove they could do it. One of those episodes was Brian and Stewie, a Season 8 bottle episode where the 2 characters are locked inside a bank vault and have to make it through an entire night. There are no cutaways. There is barely a plot. There are just 2 characters in a room talking honestly to each other about their lives, their fears, and what they mean to each other. It is one of the most widely praised episodes in the show's post-revival run.
Critics and fans who had long since given up on the show called it a reminder of what Family Guy could be. Some called it one of the best episodes in the entire series. The show made it specifically to prove it did not need the gag, and the best thing it made in years came out of that experiment. Then it went right back to building entire episodes out of cutaways. That is the real story here. The cutaway gag did not get worse because the writers got lazier or less talented. It got worse because the structure of the show reorganized itself around the gag until the gag was no longer a part of the show. It was the show. And a show that exists to deliver cutaway gags is not doing the thing that made the cutaway gag interesting in the first place. In the early seasons, the gag worked because you cared about the character who was setting it up. You cared about Peter. You understood his world. So when his brain jumped sideways to something random, it was funny because it came from somewhere real. A joke is only as good as the thing it is interrupting. When there is nothing real to interrupt, when the story is just a holder for the next gag, the interruption stops landing. The form stays. The function disappears. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings us to the characters themselves. Because the cutaway shift did not happen in isolation, it happened alongside something else, something that was changing at the same time, driven by the same underlying loss of direction. The characters who had made those early cutaways worth watching were changing too.
and no character changed more dramatically or more completely than the one the show had built its darkest and funniest original concept around. Section 4. Stewie Griffin. From Bond villain to sidekick. There is a scene in the very first episode of Family Guy where a 1-year-old baby constructs a mind control device in his bedroom, sneaks it downstairs, and attempts to use it on his mother to make her stop serving broccoli at dinner. He fails. The device malfunctions. He retreats back upstairs, sits in his crib, and delivers a quiet, furious monologue about how his plans have been temporarily delayed but are far from over. The scene is played completely straight. No one winks at the camera, no one points out how absurd it is that a baby is doing this. The show simply accepts it as a fact of this world and moves on. That is Stewie Griffin, as Seth MacFarlane originally built him. And that version of the character is one of the most genuinely strange and original things that early Family Guy ever did. MacFarlane has been specific about what Stewie was supposed to be. In the DVD commentary for the show's early seasons, he described the character as an evil Rex Harrison, meaning the voice, the manner, and the general energy were all built around Rex Harrison's performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady. Harrison played that character as someone who considered himself far above everyone around him, who found other people irritating and insufficient, and who expressed that feeling with tremendous precision and very little patience. MacFarlane took that specific quality and placed it inside a baby. A baby who meant every word. A baby who had constructed working weapons in his bedroom and had a detailed plan for world domination and was genuinely, sincerely trying to murder his mother. The character worked for a very specific reason. The show never asked you to find it cute. It never softened the premise by having Stewie secretly be sweet underneath the evil, or by having his plans fail in an adorable way that made everything feel safe. Early Stewie's plans failed because the world around him was chaotic, and he was 1 year old and physically limited, not because he did not mean it. When Stewie pointed a weapon at Lois, the show's tone did not shift into something lighter. It stayed exactly where it was. That commitment to the bit, the complete refusal to wink at the audience and say, "Don't worry, it's just a joke," is what made Stewie genuinely funny and genuinely unsettling in a way that almost nothing else on American television was doing at the time. MacFarlane had a clear plan for where the character was going. By the end of season 3, he intended for Stewie to come out as gay following a near-death experience. There was an episode written and produced titled Queer is Stewie in which this happened. It never aired. The show was canceled before season 3 finished, the episode was shelved, and when the show came back, the plan MacFarlane had for Stewie's arc came back with it, in a different form. The Queer is Stewie episode remains unaired to this day, but its existence tells you something important about how MacFarlane was thinking about this character in the original run. Stewie was not meant to stay a static, evil baby joke indefinitely. He was a character with a direction, someone the show was going to take somewhere specific over time. The matricide, the world domination, the furious British monologues. These were the surface of a character who was working something out. The cancellation interrupted that before it could land. When the show came back, MacFarlane made a decision. Rather than completing the arc he had originally planned, he opted to keep Stewie's sexuality ambiguous. His stated reason, given in an interview with The Advocate in 2008, was that the ambiguity gave the writers more to work with. He said the show treated Stewie oftentimes as if we were writing a gay character, but kept it open because jokes could be found on both sides of the question. Flexibility, in other words, was more valuable than resolution. That reasoning is understandable from a practical standpoint, but what it meant in practice was that Stewie lost his direction. The original character had a destination, a specific thing he was moving toward, a truth about himself that the show was building toward revealing. The revival-era Stewie had ambiguity instead of a destination. And ambiguity, spread across enough seasons, eventually just becomes a character who is hard to pin down rather than a character who is working something out. The change in Stewie did not happen all at once. Through season 4 and into season 5, he retained enough of the original energy that the shift was not jarring. He still made references to his plans, he still had moments of genuine menace. The show had not fully decided what to do with him yet, and that uncertainty sometimes produced interesting episodes, moments where the old Stewie and the new direction existed in the same scene and created something neither version would have produced alone. But by the time the show reached season 6, something had settled. Stewie's obsession with killing Lois had been quietly retired. It did not end with a dramatic confrontation or a revelation. It just stopped being the engine of his character.
Episodes that would have once used that obsession as their central conflict now use Stewie differently, as Brian's companion, as the show's source of pop culture observations, as a character whose humor came from his voice and his manner, rather than from the specific dark premise that had made him original. MacFarlane described this shift himself, again in DVD commentary, this time for an early Season 2 episode. He said Stewie had gone from a Bond villain to a closet homosexual. He said it matter-of-factly, as a description of what had happened, rather than as a complaint about it. But listen to those two descriptions side by side. A Bond villain and a closet homosexual are not the same kind of character. They do not produce the same kind of comedy. They do not create the same kind of tension in a scene. The Bond villain version of Stewie is a character whose presence in any scene raises the question of what he is going to try to do and whether anyone is going to stop him. The later version of Stewie is a character whose presence in a scene raises the question of what funny thing he is going to say next. One of those is dramatically interesting. The other is a very good talking head. The Brian and Stewie relationship, which became the dominant focus of Stewie's character from the revival era onward, was actually built during the original run by a gay writer in the show's early writer's room. MacFarlane acknowledged this directly in his Advocate interview. He said that for the first 3 seasons, this writer was really instrumental in building the relationship between Brian and Stewie that we kind of take for granted now. MacFarlane said it opened a door the writers had not expected. That relationship, Stewie's strange attachment to Brian, the dynamic between a homicidal infant and a world-weary dog, was discovered in the room through one specific writer's work, and it became the foundation for everything Stewie did in the revival era. That is not nothing. The Brian and Stewie dynamic produced some of the most genuinely affecting moments in the show's post-revival run. Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 bottle episode discussed in the previous section, works almost entirely because of how real their connection feels. Road to Rhode Island, one of the most praised episodes in the entire series, works because the dynamic between these two characters has enough emotional substance to carry a full episode. The relationship is real. It was built carefully by people who understood both characters, but it came at a cost. The relationship became Stewie's entire world. He stopped being a character who existed in tension with everyone, who was plotting against Lois, building machines in his room, treating the other characters as obstacles or targets. He became Brian's companion. That is a smaller existence than what he started with. A sidekick role, even a funny and well-written one, is not the same as being the show's darkest and most original concept. It is a supporting position, and a character who was designed to be anything but supporting had been quietly moved into one. The Season 16 episode, Send in Stewie, Please, is the clearest evidence of how fully the character had shifted by that point in the show's run. The episode takes place almost entirely in a therapist's office, with Stewie speaking to a psychiatrist after doing something cruel to a classmate. It is a deliberately quiet episode. No cutaways, minimal action, just a character sitting in a chair answering questions. Writer Gary Janetti, who wrote the episode, said afterward that Stewie's uncertainty about who he is had to be maintained because that uncertainty gave him vulnerability. He said the character's sexuality would not be resolved because resolving it would cost the show something it needed to keep. That is an honest and thoughtful thing to say about a character. But notice what it is also saying. By Season 16, the most interesting thing about Stewie Griffin, the thing the show most needed to protect, was not his evil plans, or his genius, or his weapons, or his fury. It was his uncertainty, his vulnerability. The show had taken a character built on absolute conviction, a baby who knew exactly what he wanted and was furious that he could not have it, and turned him into a character defined by not knowing. That is not a natural evolution. It is a replacement.
MacFarlane said in a Playboy interview that an episode had been written and taken all the way to script form in which Stewie comes out. The episode involves Stewie going back in time to prevent a specific passage from being written in a religious text, a line about men lying with men. The episode was written. It was not made. MacFarlane said in the same interview that ultimately, Stewie would end up either gay or a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. And then he said something that cuts to the heart of what happened to the character.
It also explains why he's so hell-bent on killing his mother and taking over the world. He has a lot of aggression, which comes from confusion and uncertainty about his orientation. That is a genuinely interesting piece of character psychology. The murderous fury is not random. It has a source. The world domination plans are not just a joke. They are the behavior of a character who cannot express what he actually feels and has turned all of that energy outward into violence and ambition. That reading of Stewie makes him more interesting, not less. It gives the evil baby a real interior life, and MacFarlane clearly understood that connection. He said it out loud, but the show never used it. It kept the ambiguity and dropped the conviction. It kept the sexuality vague and retired the plans for world domination. It ended up with a version of Stewie who had neither the darkness of the original nor the resolution that the original was building toward. He had Brian. He had his voice. He had funny lines about things he had seen on television and felt about the people around him. That is a lot. It is more than most animated characters have, but it is not what Stewie Griffin was built to be. There is a version of this character's story that goes differently. The original 3 seasons build toward a coming-out moment that reframes everything that came before. The Season 3 finale that MacFarlane planned, the one the cancellation prevented, actually happens. The fury makes sense. The matricide makes sense. The world domination makes sense. The show arrives at a character whose entire history suddenly reads as the behavior of someone in tremendous pain, trying to control a world that felt completely out of his control. That would have been extraordinary television. It would have been something no animated show had attempted before or since. Instead, the show got canceled. The plan evaporated. And when Family Guy came back, Stewie came back too. But the version that returned was already becoming someone different. Funnier in some ways, warmer in some ways, more flexible in every way, and fundamentally smaller than what he had started as. The character who began as a Bond villain with a real psychological core became the show's most reliable source of witty observations and its most consistent emotional support for Brian Griffin. That is not nothing, but it is a long way from where he started. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And Stewie was not the only one who made that journey. The character who changed most visibly, most dramatically, and in the most documented way was the one standing right next to him in the living room. The one who had started the whole show as a bumbling but recognizable father who actually cared about his family. What happened to Peter Griffin is a different kind of story, and it is considerably darker. Section 5. Peter Griffin, the distance between lovable idiot and psychopath. There is an episode in Season 1 of Family Guy called A Hero Sits Next Door, where Peter, trying to compete with a new neighbor who is a genuine local hero, goes to increasingly ridiculous lengths to prove he is just as worthy of respect. He fails repeatedly. He embarrasses himself and his family. At the end of the episode, the situation resolves not because Peter becomes a hero, but because he accidentally does something useful while trying to do something stupid. And the people around him, including his kids, including Lois, including his friends, still love him anyway. They are used to him. They understand him. He is their Peter, foolish and loud and completely without self-awareness, but also theirs. That episode is not remarkable by any particular measure. It is a standard early Family Guy episode doing exactly what early Family Guy episodes did. But watch it after sitting through a modern season, and something in it feels almost startling. Not the jokes, not the animation. What feels startling is that Peter Griffin in that episode is a person you can imagine actually existing. Stupid beyond all reason, yes. Unaware of how much damage he causes, absolutely. But capable of love, capable of embarrassment,
capable of caring whether the people in his house think well of him. A human being,
Even an absurd cartoon version of one, rather than a force of destruction wearing a human being's face. The distance between that Peter and the Peter who appears in the show's modern seasons is not just a matter of degree. It is a difference in kind. And tracing exactly how that distance opened up, slowly at first, then all at once, is one of the clearest ways to see what Family Guy lost and when it lost it. Peter Griffin was built from a specific reference point. MacFarlane has been open about this. The character's foundation is Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners, the loud, overconfident, fundamentally decent working-class husband played by Jackie Gleason in the 1950s. Gleason's Ralph was a big man with a big mouth who made big plans that always fell apart, but whose love for his wife Alice was never actually in question, even when everything else about him was ridiculous. That love was the anchor. You could watch Ralph humiliate himself episode after episode and still root for him because you understood that underneath all the noise was someone who genuinely meant well. Peter Griffin, in his original form, carries that anchor too. He is not a smart man. He is not a good decision maker. He causes problems everywhere he goes, mostly because he cannot see past the next 5 minutes of whatever he wants in that specific moment. But in the show's early seasons, the show is consistent about one thing. Peter loves his family. He loves Lois in a way that is genuine even when it is expressed badly. He loves his kids, including Meg, in a way the show makes clear through actual scenes rather than just assuming you already know it. There are early episodes where Peter specifically says he would take a bullet for Meg. There are early episodes where his relationship with Chris, his son's desire to be an artist, Peter's difficulty understanding that desire, is treated as a real tension between two people who love each other and do not quite know how to connect. These are not throwaway moments. They are the show doing the work of establishing that this family, for all its chaos, is a real family. The stupidity in those early seasons is a specific kind of stupidity. Peter does not understand that his actions have consequences. He does not see how what he does affects the people around him. He barrels forward with whatever idea he currently has and only understands the damage after it is done. And even then, he sometimes does not fully understand it. But, and this is the part that matters most, he is not doing any of it on purpose. He is not cruel. He is not indifferent to other people's pain. He is simply, completely, catastrophically unable to anticipate it. That is a very different thing from enjoying it. TV Tropes, in its documented analysis of the character's decline, describes Peter's early behavior as innocently insensitive, the behavior of someone too arrogant and too foolish to quite understand what he is doing wrong, rather than someone who does not care. That same analysis notes that in the early seasons, Peter usually was handed a lesson and saw the error of his ways. He received consequences. He changed, at least for the duration of the episode. The show treated his stupidity as something that produced teachable moments, which meant the stupidity was in service of something, a story with a point, a character learning something, even if he would forget it by the following week. That changed. The change was not immediate. Seasons 4 and 5 still had enough of the original Peter to feel continuous with what came before. But somewhere in the middle of the revival era, a shift began that became more pronounced with every passing season. The first clear marker most people point to is an episode in Season 4 called Petarded. In that episode, Peter takes an intelligence test and discovers he is legally considered mentally impaired. The episode uses this discovery as the basis for its humor, but it also establishes something new about Peter's character. His stupidity is now a medical fact rather than a comic exaggeration. He is not just written as foolish. He is now, within the show's own logic, clinically impaired. That is a meaningful shift. A character who is stupid because he cannot help it is one thing. A character who is stupid because the show has decided that is the only thing he is allowed to be is something else. From that episode onward, Peter's intelligence dropped in a way that did not level off. Each season seemed to find a new floor beneath the previous one. By the show's middle and later seasons, Peter was doing things that were not just foolish, but functionally impossible for any person with any level of awareness of the world around them.
The gap between too dumb to see consequences and has no detectable inner life whatsoever is a large one, and the show crossed it without ever quite announcing that it had done so. The more serious shift was not about intelligence, it was about intent. TV Tropes documents the change precisely, noting that around season 8, Peter evolved from a character who caused harm without meaning to, into a psychopathic man-child, completely apathetic to the misery he causes, and in some episodes, outright sadistic and amused by it. That is the line. Apathetic is one thing, amused is another. A character who hurts people because he cannot see that he is hurting them is a specific kind of comedy,
Rooted in a specific kind of human failure that most people recognize and can laugh at. A character who hurts people and finds it funny is not that character anymore. It is something darker and less interesting because it has removed the one thing that made the original character sympathetic, the fact that he did not mean it. The treatment of Meg Griffin is the starkest example of this shift. In the early seasons, Peter's relationship with Meg is the relationship of a father who loves his daughter, but genuinely does not understand her, and whose attempts to connect with her are almost always clumsy and sometimes harmful, but are still attempts. The early show gives them real scenes together. There is tension between them that feels like the tension between a real parent and a real teenager. Not warm, not easy, but real. And there are moments that cut through the clumsy exterior to show something genuine underneath. By season 8, as TV Tropes documents, Peter's attitude toward his own daughter had reached peak Flanderization, to him outright hating them. Season 22 has Peter attempting to manipulate Meg into an abortion and physically throwing her out of a castle. These are not the actions of a character who loves his family badly. They are the actions of a character who has lost any emotional relationship to his family entirely, and exists only to generate the next scene, whatever that scene requires. The giant chicken fights illustrate the same drift through a different lens. The first fight between Peter and Ernie the giant chicken, a full, elaborate, long-running brawl that interrupts the episode's plot and goes on far longer than any joke that size should, appears in season 2. It is funny specifically because it is so committed and so extended and so completely disconnected from anything that matters. Peter and the chicken destroy entire city blocks. Buildings collapse. Cars explode. It goes on forever. Then it ends, and the episode continues as if nothing happened. The joke is that the show took this completely seriously, while everyone watching knows it is insane. But the joke only works once as a surprise. After that, it is a familiar format. When the chicken fights became a recurring element, appearing again and again across seasons, each one longer and more elaborate and more violent than the last, what had been a specific and strange creative choice became a template. And a template can be filled with anything, which means it stops meaning anything specific. The fights got more graphic. The violence escalated. The humor in them changed from, "this is absurd and the show is committing to it," to, "this is a lot of cartoon violence and that is the joke now." Those are not the same joke. The same escalation happened across Peter's behavior broadly. Modern seasons feature Peter doing things to his family and the people around him that would have been unthinkable in season 1. Not because season 1 was precious about violence or shock content, but because season 1 still had a relationship between what Peter did and who Peter was. The things he did came from his character. They were expressions of his specific blindness, his specific loudness, his specific love that he expressed so badly it often looked like something else. When behavior becomes escalation for its own sake, when the question is not, what would Peter do here, but what is the most extreme thing Peter can do here, the character has left the building. What remains is a placeholder wearing his face. It is worth being specific about when the fans and critics most consistently identify the decline. The Loathsome Characters documentation, the TV Tropes analysis, and multiple critical reviews across the show's run converge on the same general period. Season 8, as the point where Peter's Flanderization became severe and largely permanent. That is, 4 seasons into the revival era. 4 seasons after MacFarlane handed showrunner duties to Goodman and Sheridan. 4 seasons after the show was no longer being run by the person who built Peter Griffin from a sketch of a character named Larry into one of the most recognizable faces in American animation.
That timing is not a coincidence. It is a result. The people running the show in those middle and later seasons were not trying to ruin Peter Griffin. They were trying to write a character who had originally been very specific and who, over time, without the person who built him present to say no, that is not who he is, became progressively less specific. When a character loses specificity, the instinct is to compensate with intensity, make him louder, make him more extreme, make him do bigger things. Specificity is quiet and hard to write. Intensity is easy to produce and immediately readable. So the show produced intensity season after season until the quiet human specificity of the original character was so far gone that watching the modern version next to an early episode feels like watching two different shows. The Simpsons comparison is unavoidable, and the show itself made it explicit at least once, a Simpsons crossover episode where Peter and Homer fight. Homer Simpson is the obvious ancestor of Peter Griffin. Both are fat, loud, oblivious working-class fathers with long-suffering wives and families they love imperfectly. Homer has also suffered from what people call Flanderization over the decades. His stupidity has increased, his emotional depth has decreased, his behavior has become more extreme. But TV Trope's documented comparison between the two characters makes the distinction clear. Homer, even in his most Flanderized modern form, means well and tries his best to be a good person and father. Peter, in his modern form, takes great joy in the suffering he inflicts upon others, intentionally creates chaos for the sake of chaos, and actively tries to abuse his family. Those are different characters. One is a failing human being. The other is something the show cannot quite explain without undercutting the comedy it is trying to build around him. Early Peter Griffin was a specific person. He was Ralph Cramden with a talking dog and a baby with a British accent and a Rhode Island address and a job at a brewery. He was loud and foolish and difficult and real. He was the kind of person most people have known in some form. The person in the room who means well and causes chaos and somehow, despite everything, is still loved by the people around him. That is a recognizable human type. Comedy built on recognizable human types connects to something real in the audience. It is not just funny, it is true. What replaced him is not true. It is a collection of behaviors that escalate season by season and bear less and less relationship to anyone who has ever actually existed. And that loss, the loss of a character who felt like a person, is something the show has never recovered from. But Peter's drift was slow and somewhat gradual. The character who changed fastest, most completely, and in the most openly documented and discussed way, was the one the show itself eventually put on trial. The one whose transformation was so thorough that even another character in the show gave a speech about it. The one who started as the most grounded and human presence in the Griffin house, and ended up as something the show could not quite figure out what to do with. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That character is Brian, and what happened to him is a story the show itself could not stop telling. Section 6. Brian Griffin, the voice of reason who stopped having reasons. There is a moment in Season 7 of Family Guy that the show's fans have been talking about ever since it aired. Glenn Quagmire, the neighbor, the pilot, the character the show had always used primarily as a source of sexual humor, sits across from Brian Griffin and delivers a speech. A long one. An itemized, specific, completely serious speech about every single thing that is wrong with Brian as a person. He goes through the list methodically. The pretension, the hypocrisy, the failed writing, the way Brian presents himself as someone who loves women deeply while actually treating them as things to collect, the self-righteous politics, the drinking, the complete inability to take responsibility for any of it. Quagmire is angry in the way that only someone who has been watching something go wrong for a long time and finally run out of patience can be angry. He is not cruel. He is precise. And the most remarkable thing about the scene is that he is right. The show does not frame Quagmire as being out of line. It does not undercut his speech with a joke that lets Brian off the hook. It lets the whole thing land, and then lets Brian sit with it,
unable to respond with anything that actually addresses what Quagmire said.
The scene works as a piece of television because Quagmire is describing something the audience has already noticed. Brian had become exactly what Quagmire says he is. The show knew it. It just took until season 7,
Episode 2, an episode called Jerome is the New Black, for the show to put it on screen directly.
That scene is both one of the best things the post-revival show ever did and one of the saddest. It is the show diagnosing its own problem while being unable to cure it. Brian Griffin was the character Seth MacFarlane built closest to himself. Not in the sense that MacFarlane is exactly like Brian. MacFarlane has been careful about that distinction. But in the sense that Brian is the one character in the show that MacFarlane voices in his own natural speaking voice. Every other main character required MacFarlane to do something specific and constructed with his voice. Peter has that distinctive nasally Rhode Island quality. Stewie has the precise British accent modeled on Rex Harrison. Quagmire has his own particular rhythm and register. Brian is just MacFarlane talking. That is not a small thing. When a performer plays a character in their own voice,
the distance between the performer and the character collapses in a way it does not with other characters. Brian speaks the way MacFarlane speaks. Not coincidentally, Brian in the early seasons sees the world the way MacFarlane seems to see it, with intelligence and wit, and a certain world weariness that comes from being the most aware person in a room full of people who are not aware at all. In the show's first 3 seasons and into the early revival period, Brian is the show's anchor. He is the character who most clearly understands the difference between what is happening and what should be happening. He watches Peter's plans collapse and does not pretend they were good plans. He observes the chaos of the Griffin household with the tired clarity of someone who has lived inside it long enough to stop being surprised by anything. He has his own failures. He drinks too much. He is too in love with the idea of himself as a writer. He has genuine feelings for Lois that he can never act on. But those failures are specific and human, and the show treats them with a kind of honesty that it rarely extends to the other characters. The Lois situation is worth pausing on because it is handled in the early seasons with more care than people tend to remember. Brian's feelings for Lois are not played purely for comedy. They are treated as a real emotional condition, something Brian carries, something that affects how he behaves in the house, something he cannot simply switch off. There is an early season 2 episode called Brian in Love, where the show slows down enough to take Brian's inner life seriously for a full episode. He is experiencing something he cannot explain, going to therapy, trying to understand what is wrong with him. The episode eventually reveals that his feelings for Lois are deeper than he admitted to himself.
The resolution is handled quietly, rather than with a big comedic punchline. The show trusted Brian enough to give him an episode that treated his emotional experience as worth examining. That trust was the foundation of what made Brian work in the early seasons. The show believed he was a character worth taking seriously, even inside a comedy. His failures were real failures. His loneliness was real loneliness. His writing ambitions, the unfinished novel, the sense that he was meant for something more than living in a suburban house with a family he did not belong to, were treated as genuinely felt rather than purely as the setup for jokes at his expense. The writing ambition is where the character began to drift. In the early seasons, Brian's desire to be a serious writer is a character trait with emotional depth. He wants to produce something real. He feels the gap between what he is capable of and what he actually produces, and that gap embarrasses him and drives him. It is the same gap that makes people who identify with Brian, people who feel smarter than their circumstances, who believe they are meant for something they cannot quite reach, recognize something true in him. The ambition is real. The failure is real. The combination is honest. What happened to that trait in the revival era is the clearest example of what the show did wrong with Brian across the board. The writing ambition stopped being a character trait with emotional depth and became a joke with one punchline that the show repeated endlessly. Brian's novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, becomes a recurring reference, shorthand for his pretension, his delusion, his inability to see how little talent he actually has. The show uses it to diminish him. Episode after episode establishes that Brian thinks he is a great writer and is objectively not one, and the gap between his self-image and reality is supposed to be funny. It is funny, sometimes, but it is also, across many seasons, all that is left of what had been a genuinely complex aspiration. The ambition became a punchline. The punchline became the character. The political shift followed the same pattern. In the early seasons, Brian has political views. He is liberal, thoughtful, occasionally preachy, but his views exist as one dimension of a character who has many dimensions. They inform how he sees things without being the only thing he sees. He pushes back on Peter's worldview, questions things, brings a perspective that the show uses to create friction and comedy, and occasionally something approaching genuine debate inside the Griffin house. His politics are part of who he is. IGN's review of Season 7 documented what happened next with a single sentence that remains one of the most precise descriptions of Brian's decline anyone has written.
Brian has degenerated into nothing more than a soapbox for the political views of the writers. That is the shift. His politics stopped being one dimension of his character and became the whole character. He was no longer a dog with political views. He was a political position wearing a dog costume. And a character who exists to deliver opinions rather than to be a person cannot do the things that made Brian interesting in the first place. He cannot be emotionally complex. He cannot be genuinely hurt by things. He cannot be wrong in ways that matter. He can only be right or be shown to be wrong about his politics because that is all that is left of him. The Season 8 review from IGN's Ramsey Eisler made the next step explicit. He wrote that Brian had left his lofty position as the voice of reason and switched to pretentious loser. That phrase, pretentious loser, is doing a lot of work. A pretentious loser is not the same as a flawed idealist. A flawed idealist is someone whose reach exceeds their grasp in a way you can sympathize with. A pretentious loser is someone whose self-image has completely detached from any reality the audience can verify, and who has stopped earning the sympathy that would make their failures meaningful rather than just embarrassing. The show made Brian a pretentious loser deliberately, not accidentally, not through carelessness, but through a series of choices that pushed him further and further from the character who had made Season 1 worth watching. The Quagmire speech in Jerome is the New Black captures the end result of all those choices in one scene. Quagmire tells Brian that he buys women copies of The Catcher in the Rye, and then delivers what Quagmire calls a 7th grade interpretation of why Holden Caulfield is a profound intellectual. He says Holden Caulfield was not a profound intellectual, he was a spoiled brat. And he says that is why Brian likes him so much. Because Holden Caulfield is Brian. The speech lands because it is not just Quagmire being mean, it is an accurate reading of what Brian had become, a character who confused an inflated self-image for actual depth, and who had been getting away with that confusion for long enough that he had stopped questioning it. What makes the scene genuinely sad, rather than just funny, is knowing what Brian was before all of that was true. The Quagmire speech would not work on the Brian from Season 1. It would not land on a character whose self-image was honestly earned, who actually was the most grounded person in the room, who actually did see things clearly, who actually did care about the people around him in ways that went beyond what he could get from them. The speech works on Season 7 Brian because Season 7 Brian has drifted far enough from that original version that every word Quagmire says is accurate. Brian's death in Season 12 is the most extreme example of what the character had become by that point in the show's run. He is hit by a car in an episode called Life of Brian, struck in the street, rushed to a veterinary clinic, and dies on the table with his family around him. His last words are, "You've given me a wonderful life. I love you all." The moment is played with complete sincerity. The show wants you to feel something, and many people did feel something, which tells you that despite everything, despite all the Flanderization and the political soapboxing and the pretension, there was still enough of the original Brian visible to make his death hurt. The response from fans was enormous. Family Guy's social media pages were flooded. People threatened to stop watching. A petition to bring Brian back gathered significant attention. Executive producer Steve Callahan told the press that the death had been an idea that got pitched in the writer's room that caught fire as a way to shake things up. He was brought back 2 episodes later in Christmas Guy, when Stewie traveled back in time to stop the car from hitting him. The whole arc, from death to resurrection, took less than a month of airtime. The fan response to Brian's death is worth thinking about. People were not devastated because of who Brian was in Season 12. By Season 12, Brian had been a pretentious, self-serving, hypocritical character for several seasons. People were devastated because of who Brian had been. The grief was for the earlier version, the voice of reason, the anchor, the character who saw everything clearly and carried his failures honestly. That character had been gone for years by the time the car hit him. But the audience had not forgotten him. His death cracked something open, because it made permanent what the show had already done gradually. Removed from the Griffin house the character who had once been its emotional spine. MacFarlane has said more than once, across interviews and commentary tracks, that Brian is his favorite character. That statement and the trajectory of Brian's post-revival writing are in genuine tension with each other. A creator's favorite character is usually the one they protect most carefully, the one they feel most responsible for, the one they would be most reluctant to let slip into something lesser. MacFarlane stepped away from writing the show in 2010. Brian's most severe decline, as documented by IGN's season reviews and the TV Tropes character analysis, accelerated after that point. The connection is direct. The person who cared most about Brian, who built him, who voiced him in his own natural voice, that person had stopped writing the words that came out of Brian's mouth. The words that came out instead were different, smaller, louder in compensation. The Brian of seasons 1 through 4 is a character who earns his presence in every scene he is in. He is the reason to pay attention when the chaos around him gets too loud. He is the still point. He makes the show smarter than it would otherwise be, not by lecturing about politics, but by simply being someone who thinks clearly in a world full of people who do not. That Brian is one of the best supporting characters in the history of American animated television. Thoughtful, funny, sad, honest, flawed in ways that feel earned rather than assigned. What he became is a long way from that, and the show, to its credit, knew it. Which is why it put Quagmire in a room with him and let Quagmire say every true thing out loud. The diagnosis was accurate. The show just never found the cure. But while Brian's story is about a character who drifted away from what made him great, there is another character in the Griffin house whose story is different, and in some ways, more troubling. Because she did not drift. She was pushed. Deliberately, repeatedly, and with the full knowledge of everyone in the room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened to Meg Griffin is not a story about a character losing their way. It is a story about a character being used in a way the show never fully reckoned with. And it starts with something as simple as the show's writing staff realizing they did not know how to write a teenage girl. Section 7. The Meg Problem. When cruelty stopped being satire. There is a casting fact about Family Guy that most people who grew up watching the show do not know, and it reframes the character of Meg Griffin in a way that is worth sitting with before anything else gets said about her. Meg was not always Mila Kunis. For the entire first season of Family Guy, Meg Griffin was voiced by Lacey Chabert, an actress who at the time was known primarily for playing Claudia Salinger on the drama series Party of Five, and who would later become widely recognized for her role in Mean Girls. Chabert left the show after season 1. The reason was not creative disagreement or a dispute with the production. It was scheduling. She was a working actress with other commitments, including schoolwork, and the demands of voicing a regular character on a weekly animated show were more than she could manage alongside everything else she was doing. Mila Kunis came in to replace her, starting with season 2, and has voiced Meg ever since. That detail matters not because Chabert and Kunis sound dramatically different, they do not, and most casual viewers would not notice the transition unless they were specifically listening for it, but because of what it tells you about the show's relationship to the character from the very beginning.
Meg was the kind of role where the show could change its lead actress between seasons and not feel the need to address it or even really acknowledge it. She was not precious. She was not protected. She was a slot in the cast that needed to be filled, and when the person filling it became unavailable, the show found someone else and kept going. That attitude toward the character, practical, unsentimental, not particularly invested, would define everything that happened to Meg across the show's entire run. In Season 1, Meg is written as a recognizable teenage girl, not a deep or complex one, and not one that the show had any particular ambition for beyond making her functional, but recognizable. She wants to be popular. She has a crush on a boy at school. She is embarrassed by her family in the way that teenagers are embarrassed by their families, viscerally, constantly, as if the mere existence of her parents is a personal attack. She argues with her siblings. She wants things that other girls her age want. These are not sophisticated character beats, but they are grounded in something real. You can watch Season 1 Meg and understand who she is and what she wants, even if what she wants is fairly ordinary. The show had a problem, though. The writing staff of Family Guy has been, across its entire run, predominantly male. This is not a secret and not a disputed fact. It has been noted in multiple documented analyses of the show, including Screen Rant's widely read breakdown of how Family Guy changed since its first season. The specific observation made in that analysis is direct. When the writers realized they could not write convincingly for a teenage girl, they stopped trying. Instead of finding writers who could, or working harder to get the character right, they made a creative decision that was really more of a surrender. They turned Meg into the character that everyone else in the show treats badly. They made her the punching bag. That shift did not happen in one episode. It crept in. Early in the revival era, jokes at Meg's expense were occasional, part of a broader pattern of the family being dysfunctional in ways that affected everyone. Peter would say something unkind about her, and it would land as a joke about Peter's obliviousness, rather than as a statement about Meg's worth. The family's cruelty to her was the symptom of their dysfunction, not a feature of her character. You laughed at Peter for being a bad father, not at Meg for deserving it. As the seasons progressed, that balance inverted. The jokes at Meg's expense became more frequent, more extreme, and less connected to any larger point about the family that was making them. Peter stopped being a bad father who happened to be cruel to Meg, and became a character who was cruel to Meg as a primary activity. Lois, who in the early seasons had genuine moments of maternal warmth and actual scenes where her relationship with her daughter carried emotional weight, drifted toward the same pattern. By the show's middle seasons, both parents were openly treating their eldest daughter as less than a full member of the family, and the show was playing this not as a symptom of their failures, but as a comedic premise in itself. TV Trope's Flanderization documentation describes the shift in Lois's character in terms that connect directly to what happened to Meg. Later seasons portray Lois as a mother who openly insults her children and regularly implies that she considers them a burden. That documentation places the Meg abuse within a broader collapse of the show's parental characters, Peter and Lois both drifting away from being flawed but recognizable parents toward being people who treat their children as inconveniences at best and targets at worst. Meg bears the most concentrated version of this because she was the character the show had already decided it did not know how to write for in any other way. The episode that sits at the center of any honest discussion of what the show did to Meg is Season 10's Seahorse Seashell Party. The episode's central plot involves Meg, locked inside during a storm with her family, finally confronting all of them about how they treat her. She does not do it quietly. She goes through each family member and tells them specifically and accurately what their problems are. Peter's selfishness, Lois's vanity, Chris's cruelty, Stewie's manipulation of everyone around him. She is right about all of it. The scene is the most direct Meg has ever been, the most space the show has ever given her to speak as a person with genuine observations about her own life, rather than as the subject of other people's observations about her. And then the episode does something that divided the audience sharply and has been debated ever since. After Meg's confrontation, the family begins to fall apart without someone to direct their dysfunction toward. They turn on each other. Stewie eventually explains the family needs a lightning rod. a person who absorbs all the negative energy so everyone else can function. Meg, understanding this, takes it back. She apologizes for what she said. She agrees to go back to being the person everyone treats badly so the family can hold together. The episode ends with the status quo restored. The show frames this as Meg being the strongest person in the family. She understands the situation most clearly. She makes the most self-aware decision, and she accepts her role with full knowledge of what it costs her. Some viewers read this as the show finally giving Meg something resembling genuine depth, a moment of real heroism, painful and quiet. Others read it as the show explaining and then justifying the cruelty it had been directing at her for years, and then immediately returning to that cruelty without any actual consequence. Both readings are honest responses to what the episode actually does.
What is not debatable is what happened after the episode aired. The status quo was indeed restored. The Meg abuse continued. The lightning rod explanation became, in practice, a reason the show could keep doing what it had been doing, rather than a reason to examine whether it should. The episode diagnosed the problem the way the Quagmire speech had diagnosed Brian's problem. Clearly, accurately, without flinching, and then stepped aside to let the problem continue. Season 22 provides the clearest evidence of how far the show had traveled from any version of Peter and Meg's relationship that could be described as parental. In that season, Peter attempts to manipulate Meg into having an abortion after she becomes pregnant. In another episode, he physically throws her out of a castle. These are not the actions of a bad father who loves his daughter badly. These are the actions of a character who has no detectable feeling for his daughter at all, performing cruelty because the show has decided that cruelty toward Meg is a reliable source of content, regardless of what it costs the character or the family dynamic. The contrast with how the show's early seasons handled Peter and Meg is not subtle. Multiple documented sources note that in those early seasons, there are specific scenes where Peter says he would take a bullet for Meg. The line is not played for irony. It is not immediately contradicted by a joke. It is Peter expressing something real about his relationship with his daughter, in a moment where the show believed that relationship was worth expressing. That Peter existed. He is in the episodes. You can watch him. And the distance between that character and the one throwing Meg out of a castle is so enormous that it requires active effort to believe they are the same person. Chris Griffin's trajectory mirrors Meg's in a less extreme form. In the early seasons, Chris has his own storylines. His desire to be an artist, his relationship with his father around that desire, his navigation of adolescence in a family that is not exactly equipped to help him navigate anything. These storylines treat Chris as a person with his own interior life, his own wants, his own specific way of being in the world. TV Tropes documents that around season 11, Chris took what it describes as a level in jerk-ass, becoming someone who openly insults his mother and others without provocation, and who eventually joins in on the family's treatment of Meg, rather than existing outside it. Like Meg, Chris was a character the show eventually ran out of ideas for, and then simplified down to a single behavioral note, rather than replacing that simplicity with something new. The voice casting history adds one more layer to the Meg story that is worth knowing. When Mila Kunis auditioned for the role after Lacey Chabert's departure, Seth MacFarlane called her back with a specific instruction. He told her to speak slower. Kunis has recalled this in interviews. She came in, she read, MacFarlane liked what she was doing but felt she was going too fast, and the note was simply to slow down. That is a director paying attention to performance, caring about how the character sounds, having a specific idea of what Meg's voice should do. That level of attention to Meg as a character, careful enough to give a specific performance note about her pace, is consistent with the early show's treatment of her as a person worth getting right. The Meg of the modern seasons is not a character anyone is giving careful performance notes about. She is a placeholder, a surface for other characters to bounce things off. The show occasionally remembers to give her a storyline. An episode will arrive where Meg is central, where the writers seem to have noticed that she exists as more than a punching bag and want to do something with that. But those episodes are exceptions that the show does not build on. They are isolated incidents of the show treating Meg like a character, surrounded by many more episodes of the show treating Meg like furniture. What makes this genuinely sad rather than just critically interesting is that the original premise of Meg Griffin had real potential. A teenage girl in a completely dysfunctional family trying to be normal in a situation that makes normal impossible. Navigating high school and crushes and identity while her father is Peter Griffin and her baby brother is building weapons in his bedroom. That is a character with an enormous amount of comic and emotional material available to her. She is the most grounded person in an ungrounded world. She is the one character who most wants ordinary things and is least able to have them. That tension is rich. The early show knew it and used it, imperfectly and not always with great skill, but with at least some sense that Meg was a real character worth writing for. The writing staff that could not figure out how to write a teenage girl had an option beyond turning her into a punching bag. They could have found writers who understood the character. They could have given her storylines that did not depend on understanding teenage girlhood specifically. Her place in the family, her relationship to the chaos around her, her specific way of surviving a household that would be genuinely difficult to grow up in. The material was there. The choice not to use it and to replace it with the punching bag premise instead is one of the most consequential creative failures in the show's history. Not because Meg deserved better in some abstract moral sense, though she did, but because the show lost something real when it lost that character. It lost its most grounded perspective. It lost the one person in the Griffin house who most clearly experienced the consequences of everyone else's behavior. And a show that loses its most grounded perspective has to work harder to anchor everything else. The Meg story is, at its core, a story about a writer's room that ran out of ideas for a character and chose the easiest available replacement rather than doing the harder work of finding something real. That choice seemed harmless enough at the time. It produced laughs. It was simple to write. It required almost nothing from the character beyond showing up to absorb whatever the scene needed her to absorb. But the cost accumulated. Season by season, the character who had started as a recognizable teenager became a concept. The unloved one, the unwanted one, the one who exists to make everyone else feel better about themselves by comparison. And a show that can only express its family dynamics through cruelty to the least protected member of the family has stopped being a show about a family and become something harder to name and less comfortable to watch. What is interesting, though, is that the show's decline was not only about what happened to its weakest characters, it was also about what happened to its strongest ones. Specifically, the two characters whose dynamic produced some of the best work the post-revival era ever managed. Because while Peter was becoming a psychopath, and Brian was becoming a soapbox, and Meg was becoming a punching bag, Stewie and Brian were still occasionally producing something extraordinary together. Something that reminded you, in flashes, of what the show had been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Road 2 episodes are the clearest evidence of what Family Guy could still do when it wanted to. And understanding why those episodes work, and why the rest of the show stopped working the same way, tells you something important about what early Family Guy had that its later seasons could never quite get back. Section 8. The Road 2 episodes. Evidence of what the show could do. In Season 2 of Family Guy, there's an episode where Brian realizes he has never actually met his mother. He knows she exists. He knows, in the abstract, that he came from somewhere, but the specifics of who she is and where she is have never been part of his life in any meaningful way. The episode, called Road to Rhode Island, turns this realization into a journey. Brian and Stewie travel across the country together to find her, and what they find when they get there is genuinely sad. Brian's mother is dead. She was turned into a coffee table. The show does not play this as an absurdist joke and then move on. It lets Brian feel it. It gives him a song, a real, properly constructed song called You've Got a Lot to See, in which he processes, with remarkable honesty, what it means to grow up without knowing where you came from. The song is funny, and it is also not entirely funny. It is both things at once. That episode is the first entry in what became the show's most consistent and beloved recurring format, the Road 2 series, a collection of episodes pairing Brian and Stewie on some kind of adventure, building on each other across the show's entire run, and producing, almost without exception, the most emotionally complete and best crafted work Family Guy has done since its earliest seasons.
The Road to format is a direct reference to a series of films made by Bing Crosby and Bob Hope starting in the 1940s. Those films, with titles like Road to Morocco and Road to Utopia, followed two friends getting into trouble together in exotic locations, relying on their chemistry and their willingness to break the rules of the story to carry the whole thing. MacFarlane and the writers borrowed that structure and placed Brian and Stewie inside it. And what they discovered was that those two characters had something the format required, and that the main Family Guy plots rarely demanded. Genuine, sustained chemistry that could carry a full episode without needing anything else. Chemistry between two characters is not the same as two characters being in scenes together. Almost every episode of Family Guy has the main characters in scenes together. But chemistry, the specific thing that happens when two characters have enough history and enough genuine connection and enough contrast in how they see the world, is harder to produce and rarer to find. It requires the writers to actually know both characters deeply. It requires them to understand not just what each character would say in a given moment, but how each character's way of being in the world creates friction and warmth and humor when it comes into contact with the others. That understanding cannot be faked with cutaway gags. It cannot be approximated with shock content. It has to come from somewhere real inside the writing. The Brian and Stewie dynamic that made the Road to format work was not something MacFarlane invented alone. In his interview with The Advocate in 2008, he was specific about where it came from. For the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, there was a gay writer in the show's early writer's room who MacFarlane described as really instrumental in building the relationship between Brian and Stewie that we kind of take for granted now. MacFarlane said this writer opened the door for the show to explore that particular dynamic, the strange, genuine, difficult to categorize bond between a world-weary dog and a homicidal infant. MacFarlane said he had not thought of it himself when he created the show, that it emerged from the room, specifically from this one writer who had a particular understanding of these two characters and what they could be to each other. That acknowledgement matters because it tells you something important about how the best things in early Family Guy came to exist. They were not produced by formula. They were not the result of someone deciding that Brian and Stewie would be the show's emotional core and then engineering content to fill that decision. They happened because a specific person in a specific room understood something about these two characters that nobody had fully articulated yet and brought it forward. The Road to episodes are built on that discovery. Every one of them works because someone, years earlier, had figured out what Brian and Stewie actually were to each other. Road to Rhode Island established the template in Season 2. It gave you two characters with completely different relationships to the world. Brian carrying sadness and longing and a kind of permanent disappointment in himself.
Stewie carrying fury and ambition and genuine affection for Brian that he expresses almost entirely sideways, and put them in a situation where they had only each other to rely on. The adventure plot was almost secondary. What the episode was actually about was what happened between these two characters when all the noise of the Griffin household was stripped away, and they had to figure out how to get from one place to another together. The comedy came from their dynamic. The emotion came from their dynamic. The episode worked from the inside out. Road to Europe came in Season 3, sending Stewie on a journey to reach the United Kingdom after becoming obsessed with a British children's television program. Brian ends up along for the trip under circumstances that are characteristically chaotic. The episode covers more ground in terms of location and absurdity than its predecessor, but it keeps the same basic principle intact. These two characters, alone together, navigating something neither of them fully understands, and finding that the navigation reveals things about who they are that would never come out in the normal rhythm of a Family Guy episode. Then, the show was canceled. And when it came back, the Road to format came back with it, and continued producing the most consistent quality in the revival era, even as the show around it was beginning to drift. Road to Rupert arrived in Season 5, built around Stewie's beloved stuffed bear being accidentally sold at a yard sale and the journey to get him back. Road to Germany came in Season 7, sending Mort Goldman back to World War II Poland by accident and having Brian and Stewie follow him through a time travel plot that the episode commits to with genuine energy. These episodes maintained the format's core quality because they maintained its core principle.
two characters, stripped of the usual support structure, finding out what they are to each other when there is nothing else around. Road to the Multiverse in Season 8 is the most ambitious entry in the series, and one of the most technically impressive things Family Guy has ever attempted. Stewie has built a remote control that can move between alternate universes, and he and Brian use it to visit different versions of reality, each one rendered in a different visual style.
There is a universe where everything looks like a classic Disney animated film, with lush backgrounds and musical numbers and character designs built in the style of films from the 1930s and 1940s. There is a universe rendered in the style of anime. There is a universe where humans are the pets and dogs are the masters, which the show uses to briefly but pointedly examine what Brian's life would look like from the other side. The episode works as entertainment on a pure visual level, and it also works as a Brian and Stewie story because the format gives the writers permission to keep these two characters central through every universe they visit. The adventure changes, the relationship stays constant. Road to the North Pole came in Season 9 as a Christmas episode that sends Brian and Stewie to find the real Santa Claus after Stewie becomes convinced he exists. What they find when they get there is genuinely dark. A Santa who is broken and exhausted, a North Pole that is falling apart, a situation far grimmer than either character expected. The episode handles the darkness with enough lightness to remain funny, but it does not completely diffuse it. Things are wrong in the world of that episode, and the show lets that wrongness sit without immediately resolving it into comfort. That willingness to go somewhere uncomfortable and stay there long enough to mean something is a quality that the Road to episodes have consistently, and that the main show had largely lost by Season 9. Road to Vegas in Season 11 and Road to India in Season 15 continued the series into the show's later run. Both episodes are good. Neither is quite at the level of Road to Rhode Island or Road to the Multiverse, but both demonstrate the same principle holding, that putting Brian and Stewie together in a format that requires their chemistry to carry the episode still produces something more alive and more carefully made than the average Family Guy episode from the same period. It is not that the Road to format is magic. It is that the Road to format cannot be faked. You cannot build a Road to episode out of cutaway gags and shock content. The format exposes lazy writing immediately because lazy writing has nothing to hold it up. Only real character work survives. The clearest proof of this principle is not a Road to episode at all. It is the Season 8 bottle episode called Brian and Stewie, the one produced specifically to demonstrate that Family Guy could make an episode without any cutaway gags whatsoever. The episode is exactly what it sounds like. Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked inside a bank vault over a weekend, with no way out and nothing to do but talk to each other. There is no adventure, there is no external plot, there is no cutaway gag to break the tension or fill the silence. There are just two characters in a room and 22 minutes of what happens when those two characters have only each other. What happens is extraordinary by the standards of what Family Guy had become by Season 8. They talk honestly about Brian's drinking, which he keeps a gun close by in case he ever decides he has had enough of living with it. About Stewie's feelings for Brian, which are real and deep, and not something Stewie knows how to express in any normal way. About what they mean to each other, which, as they eventually acknowledge out loud, is something close to everything. Each of them would not know what to do without the other. They are not the same kind of important to each other that friends are supposed to be, because neither of them is exactly a normal person. But they are essential to each other in a way the episode makes completely clear without ever becoming soft or sentimental about it. The episode was widely praised. Critics who had written Family Guy off as a show that had lost whatever made it worth watching called Brian and Stewie a reminder of what the show was capable of. Fans who watched every episode, regardless of quality, pointed to it as one of the best episodes in the entire series. MacFarlane said at the show's 200th episode retrospective that he was aware of how divisive some elements of the episode were, particularly a scene involving Brian eating from Stewie's diaper, which landed very differently depending on the viewer. But the broader response to the episode, beneath any specific scene's controversy, was recognition. This is what Family Guy can do. This is what it looks like when the show commits to its two best characters and trusts that their relationship is enough.
The show made that episode, and then it went back to doing what it had been doing before. That is the detail that makes the Road 2 series and Brian and Stewie sad rather than just impressive. They are proof of concept rather than direction. They demonstrate, episode after episode and across many seasons, that the writers knew how to produce something genuinely good. They had the tool. They understood the characters well enough to use it. But the tool was applied selectively, reserved for special episodes, for Road 2 installments,
for the occasional experiment, rather than becoming the standard that all episodes were held to.
The rest of the show continued accumulating cutaway gags and shock content and Flanderized characters, while the Road 2 format sat alongside all of it and continued producing something better. The reason the Road 2 episodes work, and the reason the main show stopped working as well, come from exactly the same place. Both have to do with whether the writing is built from the characters out or built from a format in. The Road 2 format forces the first approach. You cannot write Road to Rhode Island without starting from who Brian actually is and what his relationship to his past actually means to him. You cannot write Road to the Multiverse without understanding what Stewie and Brian's dynamic actually produces under pressure. The characters come first. The adventure is what happens to them.
When writing works that way, character first, plot second, jokes third, it produces something that holds together and means something. When writing works the other way, joke first, cutaway second, character somewhere after that as a loose container for everything else, it produces what Family Guy had largely become by the time the Road 2 series was already several installments deep. Two different philosophies of making television, running alongside each other in the same show. One producing the thing everyone would remember, and the other producing the content that filled the weeks between memories. Early Family Guy understood which philosophy it was working from. The first 3 seasons, and the early revival period, built their episodes from the characters out. The stories emerged from who these people were and what they wanted, and how their specific ways of being in the world created friction and comedy and occasional genuine feeling. The Road 2 episodes are the last consistent place where that original philosophy survived intact. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But character work and format are not the only things that separate early Family Guy from what it became. There is another element that gets less attention but that sits underneath everything else: the actual structure of each episode, the way stories were built and paid off, the question of whether any given episode had a reason to exist beyond filling its 22 minutes. Because early Family Guy had plots, real ones, and understanding what those plots did and what disappeared when they stopped mattering is the next piece of the story. Section 9. The plot had a point. Character goals in early Family Guy. There is an episode in Season 1 of Family Guy called Mind Over Murder, where Peter accidentally punches a pregnant woman at a youth soccer game and gets sentenced to house arrest. That is the setup. What the episode does with that setup is the thing worth paying attention to. Peter, stuck inside, goes slowly crazy from boredom. He decides to build a bar in his basement. The bar becomes a neighborhood gathering place. Lois, who has been frustrated for years about never having a real outlet for her musical ambitions, starts performing there as a singer. She becomes popular. People love her. She starts to find something she had been missing. Peter, who built the bar for himself, now has to reckon with the fact that he accidentally gave his wife something real and meaningful, and has to figure out what that means for both of them. That is a plot. Not a complicated one, and not one that takes itself too seriously, but a plot with a beginning and a middle and an end, and characters who want specific things, and whose wanting of those things creates the story. Peter wants freedom from his house arrest. Lois wants to express herself musically. Those two wants collide and produce something neither of them expected. By the end of the episode, both characters have been somewhere and come back changed in small ways that feel earned. The cutaway gags are in there too. The jokes are in there, but they are sitting inside a story that has its own shape and reason for existing. That is what early Family Guy was built on, and it is the thing that disappeared most quietly and most completely as the show went on.
The clearest way to see what the early show was doing is to look at its characters and ask what they wanted. Peter wanted to be respected by his boss, by his family, by the neighborhood around him. He rarely got it, which produced most of his plots. Lois wanted the life she had chosen with Peter to feel like enough, and sometimes it did, and sometimes it did not. And the tension between those two states gave her real scenes with real stakes. Brian wanted to write something that mattered and could not seem to produce it, and that gap between ambition and output made him interesting to watch, even when nothing dramatic was happening to him. Stewie wanted to kill his mother and dominate the world, and the spectacular failure of every attempt to do either gave his sections of every episode a dark comedic momentum. These are not complicated character goals. They do not require a dramatic writing staff or a huge budget or any particular sophistication to execute. They just require the writers to know what each character is after and to build the episode around the collision of those pursuits. When a show does that, when it starts from character desire and builds outward, the audience has a reason to watch beyond the next joke. They are watching to see whether the character gets what they want. They are invested in the outcome. The jokes land harder because they are interrupting something that matters, even slightly. Peter's job at the Pawtucket Brewery is a good example of how this worked in practice. The brewery gave him a stable world outside the house, a boss named Angela, co-workers, a physical place he went to every day that had its own logic and its own relationships. Storylines that started at the brewery had a setting with established rules. When something went wrong at work, it went wrong in a context the audience already understood. The joke about Peter doing something idiotic at the brewery landed differently than a random joke about Peter doing something idiotic because the brewery had weight. It was real in the way that a fully established location becomes real over time. In later seasons, Peter's employment became largely irrelevant. He cycled through jobs, lost and regained his position at the brewery without the changes meaning much, and eventually the workplace stopped functioning as a meaningful part of his world. The brewery was still referenced, Angela was still occasionally on screen, but the location had lost its weight because the show had stopped using it as a place where things actually happened to a character the audience was following. It became background, scenery, a setting that existed to be mentioned rather than a world that existed to generate stories. The same thing happened to the show's ongoing storylines more broadly. Early Family Guy had actual continuity running beneath its episode-to-episode comedy. Bonnie Swanson, the wife of Peter's friend Joe, was visibly pregnant for approximately 7 seasons. This was a running joke, yes, the pregnancy that never ended, but it was also a piece of genuine continuity that the show was maintaining deliberately. The audience noticed it. It became something they tracked across episodes, a background detail that accumulated meaning simply by persisting. When Bonnie finally gave birth in season 7, the show acknowledged the joke directly, having a character note that the baby would already be about 18 years old. It was funny because the show had maintained the bit long enough for the payoff to land with real weight. Kevin Swanson, Joe's son, returning from military service in the season 10 Thanksgiving episode, is another example of the show treating its own history as something worth honoring. Kevin had been mentioned, had existed as a piece of the neighborhood's reality, and his return was treated as a genuine event. Something that carried meaning because the character and his absence had been part of the show's world. That kind of storytelling requires the writers to remember what they have established, to treat the show's history as a resource rather than an obstacle, and to believe that the audience has been paying enough attention to care about a callback to something established seasons earlier. The documented analysis from CBR puts it simply. Underneath all the jokes and the cutaway gags, early Family Guy had a backbone. The show was not just a delivery mechanism for humor. It was telling an ongoing story about a specific family in a specific place, and the humor existed inside that story rather than instead of it. When the humor was very good, it elevated the story. When the story was doing something real, it gave the humor somewhere to land. Modern Family Guy, as multiple documented analyses describe it, reversed that relationship entirely. The writers would generate banks of joke ideas, cutaway gags, standalone bits, references to other things, and then build the thinnest possible story around them to create the impression of an episode.
The story is not where the energy goes. The story is the skeleton that holds the jokes up, and it is only as solid as it needs to be to keep everything from falling over. MacFarlane himself gave an interesting window into how the early show thought about its own construction. He explained that the first few seasons of Family Guy used ominous, dramatic titles for their episodes, names like Death Has a Shadow and Mind Over Murder, because he was a fan of 1930s and 1940s radio thriller programs, particularly an anthology show called Suspense. Those programs took themselves seriously in their presentation even when the content was heightened or over the top. MacFarlane said the team eventually dropped that naming approach when individual episodes became difficult to identify by title alone and the novelty wore off. But the impulse behind those early titles tells you something about how the show understood itself in its beginning. It was an animated sitcom that thought of its individual episodes as complete things with weight and shape, things worth giving serious, evocative names to. An episode called Death Has a Shadow is making a small promise about itself. It is saying that something in this episode has stakes. Something in it lands with enough meaning to justify that title. The early show kept that promise more often than not. It built episodes that had a reason to exist beyond filling their time slot. Episodes where something happened to someone that mattered within the world of the show, even if that world was absurd and the mattering was modest. The later show largely stopped making that promise. Episode titles became functional descriptions or throwaway phrases rather than anything that suggested the episode had a particular identity. The content followed the same pattern. Episodes happened, cutaway gags appeared, characters did things. The 22 minutes filled themselves. But the sense that any particular episode was a complete thing with its own specific shape and reason for being, that largely disappeared. What is lost when plot structure disappears is not just narrative satisfaction. It is the mechanism by which jokes earn their laughs. A joke that interrupts something is funnier than a joke that replaces something, because the interruption creates contrast. When the audience is following a story and caring about the outcome, even slightly, the cutaway gag that pulls them away from it is funnier because of what it is pulling them away from. The relief of the interruption, the sudden shift in register, the surprise of the cut, all of that lands harder when there is something real being interrupted. When there is nothing real being interrupted, the cutaway is just a scene change. It has no friction to push against. It lands flat and moves on. This is why the Road 2 episodes, discussed in the previous section, produce better cutaway-free comedy than most modern Family Guy episodes produce with their cutaways fully intact. The Road to format gives the jokes something to sit inside. They are interrupting a real story about two real characters who want something and are trying to get it. When the joke lands, it lands against that background and borrows its energy from it. Early Family Guy understood this instinctively. The writers were not thinking in terms of theory about how jokes work. They were just building episodes the right way. Story first, characters with goals, humor emerging from the collision of those goals with the world the show had created. The result was a show that felt alive in a specific way, episode after episode, because something was always actually happening. Something was always at stake, even when the stakes were small. Even when the episode was just Peter wanting to be respected at a neighborhood soccer game, or Lois wanting to sing in a bar her husband accidentally built. Those small wants produced real stories, and real stories produced real comedy. The loss of that structure is the quietest of all Family Guy's losses. It does not announce itself the way a character's Flanderization announces itself. It does not produce a specific moment you can point to and say, there, that is when it went wrong. It just seeps away gradually, season by season, as the jokes get louder and the stories get thinner, and the show that once had a backbone becomes a show that is mostly made of noise. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But noise, pushed far enough, becomes something specific, and Family Guy, in pushing its content further and further in search of reaction, arrived somewhere that the early show would not have recognized as its own. The escalation toward shock, toward graphic content, toward transgression as a creative mode rather than a creative tool, that is its own story.
And it explains, more than almost anything else, why the modern show can feel exhausting to watch in a way the early show never did.
Section 10. The shock value escalation. When edgy became the only move.
There is a specific kind of comedy that comes from crossing a line. It works because the line is real, because the audience has a clear sense of where normal is, and the joke lands by going somewhere past it. The distance between where you were and where the joke took you is the source of the laugh. Cross the line once with enough commitment and surprise, and the result can be genuinely funny. Cross it again in the same direction, and the laugh gets smaller. Cross it enough times, and the line moves. The audience recalibrates. What felt transgressive becomes familiar. And then, the only way to get the same reaction is to go further. That is the trap Family Guy walked into. And the walk was so gradual that by the time the show was deep inside it, there was no obvious path back out.
The early seasons of Family Guy were, by the show's own later standards, remarkably restrained. This is not a subjective impression. It is something that multiple documented comparisons of early and late episodes consistently confirm. Season 1 of Family Guy is a tame piece of television. The family dynamics are the main focus. The humor is observational and character-based. The edginess is present but modest, a slightly darker version of a regular animated sitcom rather than something genuinely designed to shock. Fox's censors, strict with the show because it was new and unproven, kept a tight leash on what could make it to air. The writers had to find ways to be funny within real limits. Those limits, as it turned out, were productive. When you cannot reach for the obvious transgressive choice, you have to find something better. The jokes in Season 1 are frequently clever in a way the later seasons are not, precisely because the later seasons did not need to be clever. Cleverness is a tool you develop when the easy option is unavailable. Season 1 did not have the easy option, so it developed the tool. By the time the show returned from cancellation and Fox had loosened its restrictions on the content considerably, the tool was still there, but the habit of reaching for it first had started to weaken. The Parents Television Council, a media watchdog group, was a consistent and vocal critic of Family Guy across its entire run. They organized campaigns to have the show removed from Fox's schedule. They filed complaints with the Federal Communications Commission about specific episodes containing content they considered harmful. MacFarlane's response to the council was not measured. In a documented interview from 2005, he described them in terms that left no ambiguity about how seriously he took their objections. He said being criticized by them was like getting hate mail from Hitler, and described them as literally terrible human beings. That response tells you something about how the show understood its own relationship to transgression, not as a carefully managed creative choice, but as a point of pride, a statement of identity, a marker of the show's willingness to go where other shows would not. That identity, the show that does not care what you think, the show that will go there, the show that pushes back against anyone who tells it to stop, is a real and legitimate creative position. Some of the best comedy in history has come from exactly that place. But it requires something to stay functional. It requires the transgression to be in service of something, a joke that reveals something true, a moment of darkness that earns its place by saying something the lighter version of the scene could not say. When transgression is in service of something, it has a reason to be as extreme as it is. When it stops being in service of anything and becomes the point itself, it is no longer a creative choice, it is a habit. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike provides a useful window into what the show had become by that point in its run. When writers across Hollywood walked off the job in a dispute over pay and conditions, Fox continued producing Family Guy without MacFarlane's approval. 3 episodes aired without him having any final say over their content. MacFarlane called this a colossal mistake in a Variety interview. The episodes went out, the audience watched them. And the fact that those episodes were largely indistinguishable from the ones MacFarlane had approved, that the show could keep producing its particular brand of content without its creator's oversight, and the result looked essentially the same, says something significant about where the content had gone. The transgression had become a format. It no longer required its inventor to produce it. Anyone who understood the formula could generate more of it, because the formula was now the whole thing. The escalation is most visible in the violence.
Early Family Guy had cartoon violence, in the sense that almost all animated shows have cartoon violence. Characters got hurt, physical comedy involved pain.
The consequences of stupid decisions were sometimes shown with exaggeration. But the violence had a relationship to the comedy around it. It was proportionate. It served the joke rather than being the joke. The giant chicken fight in Season 2 works because it is a completely disproportionate response to a small irritation, sustained so far past the point of reason that the commitment to the bit becomes the source of the humor. The violence is enormous, and the show knows it is enormous, and plays that knowing as the comedy. By the later seasons, the violence had changed its relationship to the comedy entirely. Documented examples from modern episodes include Peter using a forklift to disembowel a beached whale, a character being sawed in half with a machete, Quagmire shooting Peter in the head in a way that leaves the eyeball visibly dangling, and Stewie spending an entire episode with the top of his head removed and his brain exposed. These are not proportionate responses to small irritations sustained past the point of reason. They are graphic images presented because the show had run out of other ways to generate a reaction and had settled on visual extremity as the reliable fallback. The distinction between those two kinds of violence is the distinction between a joke that uses shock to create comedy and a joke where shock is the comedy. The first kind requires craft. The show has to know why this moment of violence is funny, what it is expressing, what contrast it is creating, why the extremity is the right choice for this specific scene. The second kind requires only the willingness to go there. Any show with loose enough standards can produce graphic content. Not every show can produce a graphic moment that is genuinely funny because of what it means in context. Early Family Guy, at its best,
was doing the second. Modern Family Guy settled into the first. The same escalation happened with sexual content, which became more graphic over seasons in a way that tracked directly with the violence. And with the use of language, the show pushed further into territory that the early seasons had not gone near, not because the early show was precious about language, but because the early show was still using restraint as a tool, rather than treating its absence as a feature. 2 episodes that aired back-to-back in Season 10 are consistently cited as among the most extreme examples of the show's later content. Seahorse Seashell Party, discussed in the Meg section, aired alongside Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, an episode about domestic abuse.
The domestic abuse episode was widely criticized at the time and has continued to be criticized since, not because the subject matter is off-limits to comedy, but because the episode did not handle the subject matter in a way that had any clear comedic or emotional point. Critics called it mean-spirited in a way that did not seem to understand what it was being mean about or why. It stands as a particularly clear example of the show reaching for transgressive subject matter without the craft to do anything meaningful with it. Herbert the Pervert is another case study in how the escalation worked over time. Herbert first appeared in Season 4 in an episode called To Love and Die in Dixie, an episode set in the South where the character served a specific plot function and whose jokes, while clearly transgressive in subject matter, were calibrated to land in a particular way. The character was brought back because the audience responded to him. He became a recurring presence. His appearances became more frequent. His jokes became more explicit. What had been a controlled deployment of a transgressive character became an ongoing vehicle for escalating content, used episode after episode until the original calibration had been stretched far past the point where it could still produce the effect it was originally designed to produce. This pattern, a transgressive element introduced carefully, deployed effectively, and then repeated until it stops working and has to be pushed further to compensate, is the fundamental mechanism of the show's content escalation. It happened with Herbert. It happened with the giant chicken fights. It happened with Quagmire's characterization, which began as a specific comedic type and became progressively more extreme as the show leaned harder on his particular brand of humor to generate reactions. It happened across the board, with almost every element of the show that had transgressive potential, because the show had adopted transgression as an identity, and identity requires maintenance. What is important to understand is that none of this was inevitable. The early show was transgressive too,
It just used transgression more precisely.
The episode Death Has a Shadow, the show's very first episode, involves Peter committing welfare fraud and briefly losing custody of his children. That is not a gentle premise. The show was never soft. But the transgression in that episode is in service of something. A story about a man whose bad decision has real consequences, which the show follows through to a resolution that means something. The darkness earns its place because it is connected to characters and consequences the audience has been given a reason to care about. When transgression is connected to characters and consequences, it can be as dark as the story requires. When it is disconnected from both, when it is simply a graphic image or an extreme action dropped into an episode because the episode needed something to happen, it is just content. Expensive to produce, easy to generate, and fundamentally empty, no matter how extreme it gets. The exhaustion that many longtime viewers of Family Guy describe when talking about the later seasons comes from exactly this place. It is not that the content is too dark or too graphic in some abstract sense. It is that the darkness and the graphic quality are no longer producing anything beyond themselves. They are the show spinning in place, generating more and more of what it has learned to produce, because that is what the machine is built to make now, without any of the craft or intention that made the original versions of those same elements worth watching. Early Family Guy was sometimes shocking, but it was shocking in the way that a joke can be shocking, because it went somewhere specific and surprising that revealed something, even something small, about the characters or the world they lived in. The shock was the delivery. Modern Family Guy is sometimes shocking too, but the shock stopped being the delivery and became the destination, and a show that is going nowhere except further is not going anywhere at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings us to the character who experienced all of this drift from the closest possible position. The one character who was present in every version of the show, who saw what it was in the beginning and what it became, and who the show itself eventually used to acknowledge, quietly and without much fanfare, that something had been lost. Lois Griffin was there for all of it. And what happened to her across 20-plus seasons is the most overlooked part of Family Guy's decline. Section 11. Lois Griffin and the Disappearing Protagonist. There is a detail about how Alex Borstein got the role of Lois Griffin that most people who have watched hundreds of hours of Family Guy have never heard. Borstein was working on Mad TV when MacFarlane brought her in to read for the part. She had not met him before the audition. She had not seen any of his artwork or read any scripts or been given a detailed brief about who this character was supposed to be. She walked in essentially blind and performed a voice she based on one of her own cousins, a red-headed mother whose particular way of speaking Borstein had clearly absorbed well enough to reproduce without preparation. MacFarlane heard it and knew immediately it was right. That story matters because of what it tells you about the character at the point of her creation. Lois Griffin was real enough in MacFarlane's head that when someone walked in and accidentally found her, not through careful study of the character, but through a natural impression of a real person, he recognized her instantly. She was specific. She had a sound that belonged to her alone. She was, from the very beginning, a person rather than a function. And for a long time, the show treated her that way. Lois Griffin's backstory is one of the most quietly interesting setups in the show's entire world. She comes from money. Real money. The Pewterschmidt family, her father Carter's domain, is wealthy in the specific way that old families with old money are wealthy. Carter has a mansion, a staff, business interests, and an opinion about everything and everyone. Lois grew up inside all of that. She had the upbringing, the expectations, the whole weight of a certain kind of life pointed at her from birth, telling her who she was supposed to become. And then she met Peter Griffin. Loud, foolish, working class, completely unlike anyone her family would have chosen for her. And she chose him anyway. She walked away from the life her family had built for her and made a different one. That choice is the foundation of who Lois is. Everything interesting about her character in the early seasons comes from that foundation. She is a woman who made a real decision,
Not a small one,
not a safe one, and who lives with the consequences of it every day. The house in Quahog is not what the Pewterschmidt mansion was. Peter is not what her family imagined for her. The life is messier and louder and more chaotic than anything she grew up expecting. And yet, in the early seasons, the show is consistent about something crucial. She does not regret it. She chose this. She keeps choosing it. Her love for Peter, for all the frustration it carries with it, is real. That realness gave the show enormous material to work with. A character who made a genuine choice and is committed to that choice, but who still carries the weight of the road not taken. That is a character with genuine inner life. Early Lois had ambitions that the show treated with seriousness rather than as punchlines. She wanted to perform. She had real musical ability, and the early seasons gave her actual opportunities to express it, including in Mind Over Murder, where her singing career in Peter's basement bar is treated as something that genuinely matters to her, rather than as a setup for a joke at her expense. She wanted to be a good mother in a house that made good mothering nearly impossible, and the tension between that want and her reality gave her scenes with each of her children that felt earned rather than functional. Her relationship with her father Carter is one of the show's most reliably well-written dynamics in the early and middle seasons. Carter disapproves of Peter. He makes this clear without needing to say it constantly. It shows up in how he addresses Peter, how he talks about him to others, how he observes the life his daughter has chosen and finds it insufficient. Lois sits between them. She loves her father and has complicated feelings about the world he represents, and she loves her husband and has equally complicated feelings about the world he inhabits, and navigating the distance between those two worlds gives her something real to do in almost every episode where both men are present. TV Trope's documented analysis of her character describes the early seasons accurately. Lois had goals and ambitions that she had given up in order to build the life she chose with Peter, and the show depicted her as content with the life she had, even while acknowledging what she had sacrificed. That is a delicate balance. Content, but not oblivious. Satisfied, but not without loss. It is the balance of a real adult who has made real choices and learned to live inside them without pretending the choices cost nothing. Then that balance went away. The shift in Lois happened more slowly than the shifts in Peter, Brian, and Stewie, which is probably why it gets discussed less. It was not marked by a single dramatic change the way Stewie's evil plans were retired or Brian's political soapboxing accelerated. It was a gradual draining, the ambitions disappearing quietly, the maternal warmth cooling slowly, the space between who she was and who the show needed her to be widening season by season until the gap was too large to ignore. TV Trope's Flanderization documentation describes the end result precisely. Later seasons portray Lois as a mother who openly insults her children and regularly implies she considers them a burden. The documentation adds something more specific, that Lois in later seasons is heavily implied to be deeply unhappy, spending most nights drinking whole bottles of wine to cope with a life she can no longer pretend is what she wanted. That is not a small shift. That is the inversion of who she was. A character who was established as genuinely content with her choice, despite its costs, has been replaced by a character who is barely coping with a life she resents. The wine is worth lingering on for a moment because it is such a specific and deliberate creative choice. In the early seasons, Lois drinks socially and occasionally uses alcohol to deal with stress the way many adults do, lightly, occasionally, without it defining her. In the later seasons, the drinking becomes a character note. It appears regularly, it is used for quick jokes, and the accumulation of those quick jokes across many seasons produces a character portrait that nobody in the writer's room may have consciously intended, but that is unmistakably there. Lois Griffin is a woman who has given up on being okay, and is managing the distance between herself and that reality with alcohol. That is a genuinely dark characterization for a character who was originally built on genuine contentment. Her relationship with her children followed the same downward arc. In the early seasons, Lois has real individual relationships with each of her kids. Her dynamic with Meg carries actual maternal weight. She is not a perfect mother to Meg. She sometimes contributes to Meg's misery in recognizable maternal ways,
but she sees Meg as her daughter and treats her as someone whose well-being matters. Her relationship with Chris involves genuine parental engagement. His artistic ambitions are something she actually responds to in ways that differ from how Peter responds, and that tell you something specific about who Lois is. Her relationship with Stewie is built on the premise that she loves a child who is trying to murder her, which is inherently comic, but also gives her a consistent and real position in every scene they share. In the later seasons, all three of those individual relationships collapsed into a single generalized attitude. Lois became a mother who treats her children as a category rather than as people. The specific and different dynamics she had with each of them faded. What replaced them was the same general note of exasperation and occasional cruelty that Peter was expressing, which meant that the Griffin parents became increasingly interchangeable in how they related to their own children. Two different parental personalities, Lois's complicated warmth and Peter's oblivious love, flattened into one shared posture of parental indifference. The house lost a dimension. The comparison to Marge Simpson is one that the show itself has invited repeatedly through crossovers and direct references, and it is instructive. Both Marge and Lois began as genuine co-protagonists, women with their own inner lives, their own histories, their own specific ways of engaging with the chaos around them. Both have been affected by the long-run problem of a show that started running out of things to do with its female characters. But Marge retained more of her original characterization across The Simpsons run than Lois retained across Family Guy's. Marge is still recognizably the character she was in Season 1 in a way that modern Lois is not recognizably the character she was in Season 1. The drift in Lois was faster and more complete. Part of the reason for that difference is structural. The Simpsons has always had a large and diverse writing staff that included women who could bring genuine understanding of Marge's perspective to the room. Family Guy's writing staff, documented as predominantly male across its entire run, was always going to struggle more with female characters. Not because male writers cannot write women, but because a room with no diversity of perspective tends to produce characters whose inner lives look like what the majority of the room imagines those inner lives to be, rather than what they actually are. Meg became a punching bag when the room ran out of ideas for her. Lois became a background presence when the room ran out of ideas for her too. Both outcomes are connected to the same root. What makes Lois's decline particularly significant to the show's overall quality is what she represented in the early seasons functionally. She was the show's moral anchor. Not in a preachy or heavy-handed way. She was not the character who delivered lessons at the end of episodes while soft music played. But she was the character whose perspective on the family's dysfunction was grounded and clear-eyed. She saw Peter accurately. She understood her children individually. She maintained a relationship with reality that nobody else in the house quite managed. When the show needed a character who could say something true about what was happening and be believed, Lois was that character. When she lost that function, when she drifted from moral anchor to fellow participant in the family's cruelty and dysfunction, the show lost its most important stabilizing presence. A family comedy without a stabilizing presence is just chaos. Chaos can be funny, but chaos cannot be meaningful, cannot produce genuine emotional moments, cannot make you feel anything about the people you are watching beyond whatever the immediate joke requires you to feel. The early show could make you feel things about the Griffins because it had Lois holding the center. The later show had no center to hold. Alex Borstein, who found the character by accident in an audition room, has been the voice of Lois Griffin for more than 25 years. The voice has not changed, the delivery has not changed, the technical quality of the performance is the same now as it was in 1999. What changed is what the voice was given to say, and who the character speaking it was allowed to be. The woman Borstein walked in and found, based on a cousin, unrehearsed, instantly recognizable to her creator, was a specific and real person. The character she voices today is a function, a role in scenes, a presence without a center. The story of what happened to Lois is the story of what happened to Family Guy in miniature. A specific, real, carefully observed thing was gradually replaced by something more convenient, something easier to write, easier to use, easier to fill episodes with. The replacement is not obviously worse in any single scene.
It is only when you hold it next to the original that the distance becomes impossible to ignore. Early Family Guy had a co-protagonist who grounded everything around her. Modern Family Guy has a character named Lois Griffin who speaks in her voice and wears her face and shares her history on paper. The difference between those two things is the difference between a show that knew what it had and one that forgot while it was still using it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings us to the final question. Because Family Guy, despite everything discussed in these sections, the lost structure, the Flanderized characters, the escalating shock content, the disappeared co-protagonist, is still on television, still being made, still being watched, and understanding why that is true and what it tells us about the show and about television itself is the last piece of the story. Section 12. Why Family Guy still runs and what that tells us. On April 2nd, 2025, Fox announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons. The deal takes the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season. That means Family Guy, which first aired on January 31st, 1999, Will have been running continuously, minus the 3 years it spent canceled, for approximately 3 decades by the time those new seasons finish airing. 3 decades. A show that was once canceled because nobody could find a network willing to buy its rerun rights for anything above basically nothing will have outlasted almost every other scripted show in the history of American primetime television. As of early 2025, Family Guy has produced more than 409 episodes. Only 3 American scripted primetime shows have run longer: The Simpsons, Law & Order Special Victims Unit, and the original Law & Order. Family Guy sits in 4th place on that list and is still climbing. The show that Fox discarded twice, that spent years surviving on DVD sales and late-night reruns, that came back from the dead based on a fan base's refusal to let it go, is now one of the most durable television institutions in the country. That fact raises an obvious question. If everything discussed across the previous 11 sections of this essay is true, if the characters have been hollowed out, if the structure has collapsed, if the creative intelligence that built the show has been absent from the writing process for 15 years, if the content has escalated past the point where the escalation produces anything meaningful, then why is the show still here? Why does Fox keep ordering it? Why do millions of people keep watching it? The answer is not that the show got good again. The answer is something more interesting and more complicated than that, and it tells you as much about how television works in the modern era as it tells you about Family Guy specifically. The first part of the answer is the simplest. Family Guy moved to Disney Plus for streaming in 2021. That single move changed the show's relationship to its audience in a fundamental way. Streaming does not require you to be home at a specific time on a specific night. It does not require you to watch an episode from beginning to end in one sitting. It does not even require you to be paying close attention. It allows a completely different relationship between a viewer and a show, one where the show is background, company, ambient noise, something playing while you do something else, and Family Guy is extraordinarily well suited to that relationship. Think about what Family Guy actually is in structural terms. It is a 22-minute episode divided into short segments by cutaway gags that each last between 5 seconds and 2 minutes. The jokes are almost entirely self-contained. You do not need to have seen the previous episode to understand what is happening in the current one. You do not need to be following a character arc or a seasonal story to get the humor. You can look up from whatever else you are doing, catch a cutaway gag, laugh or not laugh, and look back down without having missed anything that will matter 2 minutes later. The show is, structurally, perfectly designed for the age of distracted viewing. This is not a compliment in the direction the show was originally built. Early Family Guy required more attention than that. The jokes in the first 3 seasons were frequently built into the dialogue. They required you to hear the setup and the punchline in sequence,
delivered by characters whose voices and rhythms you had learned to read. The cutaway gags in those early seasons were funnier if you understood why the character setting them up was the one setting them up, if you knew Peter's specific relationship to the memory he was referencing. The early show rewarded attention. The modern show does not require it. A show that does not require attention is a show that can run forever in the background. And a show that can run forever in the background is enormously valuable to a streaming platform that needs content to keep subscribers from canceling.
Disney Plus, having acquired Fox's entertainment properties, owns Family Guy. Every episode ever made. More than 400 of them. That library sits on the platform, available at any time, generating viewing hours that Disney Plus counts toward its subscriber engagement numbers. New episodes add to that library. New seasons mean new content that keeps the show visible on the platform's front page. Family Guy is not just a show at this point, it is a content asset. And content assets with more than 400 episodes and 3 decades of brand recognition are not canceled. They are maintained. The social media dimension of the show's persistence is equally significant. Family Guy's cutaway gags, edited into short clips, are among the most shared pieces of video content on YouTube and TikTok. Out-of-context clips of individual moments, a 2-minute cutaway presented without any of the episode around it, perform extremely well on these platforms because they are exactly the right length and shape for the format. Short, complete, requiring no context, immediately readable to anyone who has ever encountered the show's visual style. A person who has never watched a full episode of Family Guy in years might still encounter 5 or 6 Family Guy clips a week on social media without seeking them out. That passive exposure maintains the show's cultural presence in a way that actual viewership numbers alone would not. The clips that perform best on social media are almost always from the earlier seasons. The cutaway gags that get millions of views on YouTube are frequently from seasons 2, 3, and 4. The ones with actual jokes built around character-specific setups, the ones with timing that holds up decades later, the ones that landed because something real was being interrupted. The modern clips circulate too, but less consistently and with less durability. The early show's jokes are being discovered by teenagers who were not alive when they first aired, and those teenagers are encountering them as self-contained viral moments rather than as parts of an episode. The show they are finding through those clips is, largely, the early show, but their engagement with that content registers as engagement with Family Guy broadly, which means the brand maintains its cultural energy even when the current product is not producing the clips that fuel it. This creates a genuinely strange situation. Family Guy in 2025 is culturally sustained by material produced in 1999, 2000, 2001, and the early revival years. Content made by a specific group of people operating under specific creative conditions that no longer exist. The audience engaging with that content on social media is, effectively, watching the early show, but their engagement supports the continued production of the modern show. The early show is keeping the modern show alive without anyone having to acknowledge that this is what is happening. The Emmy nomination from 2009 is worth mentioning as a marker of where the show stood at a particular moment in this story. In that year, Family Guy was nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, only the second animated show to receive that nomination in the sound era of television, after The Flintstones in 1961. Nearly 50 years separated the two nominations. The 2009 nomination reflected genuine, critical recognition of what Family Guy had accomplished across its run to that point. The revival had produced enough strong work that the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences was willing to put it in a category alongside the best live-action comedies of the year. That recognition was real and earned. Family Guy did not win. South Park took the award that year. But the nomination itself stands as a high watermark, the moment when the outside world's recognition of what the show could do reached its peak. In the years after that nomination, the show's critical standing declined steadily. The nominations stopped, the awards conversation moved on. The show kept producing, kept airing, kept growing its episode count, without the critical attention that had once accompanied its best work. It became, in the language that critics use for shows that reach a certain age, a part of the furniture. Something that exists. Something you know is there. Something whose specific qualities you stopped examining closely years ago.
The Sunday night slot after The Simpsons on Fox, which Family Guy has occupied for much of its post-revival run, is its own kind of life support. That slot is one of the most established time slots in American television. Audiences who watch The Simpsons are already sitting in front of the television. The remote is in their hand. Family Guy comes on next. Changing the channel requires active effort. Watching does not. In television terms, that inertia is worth millions of viewers per episode. Viewers who are not necessarily choosing Family Guy specifically, but who are watching it because it is what comes next. Their viewership is real, and it is counted. But it is a different kind of engagement than the audience that bought the DVDs in 2003 and watched every episode with full attention because they genuinely wanted to see what happened. Adult Swim, the network that saved Family Guy from total obscurity by buying its rerun rights for almost nothing in 2003, brought the show back to its lineup beginning January 1st, 2025. The return was announced in December 2024, with marathon blocks running over multiple days and then regular weekday airings. The show that Adult Swim once acquired as a throwaway because no one else wanted it now returns to the network as a known quantity, a legacy property with a proven track record in the late-night block. The wheel has completed its full turn. Family Guy went from Adult Swim to Fox Revival to streaming institution to Adult Swim again. The journey is, in its own way, remarkable. None of this means the show is bad in every episode it has produced since the early years. That would not be accurate, and it would not be honest. There are individual episodes in almost every season that remind you, in flashes, of what the show was capable of at its best. The Road To episodes, discussed at length in Section 8, maintained genuine quality across the show's entire run. Brian and Stewie is one of the best things the show has ever done, and it aired in Season 8. Individual writers, in individual episodes, have occasionally produced something that connects back to the original show's way of working, building from character out, finding humor inside a real story, trusting the audience to follow something that takes longer than a cutaway to pay off. But individual episodes are not a show. A show is what it does consistently, across seasons, as a statement of what it believes about itself and its audience. And what Family Guy does consistently in its modern era is what has been described across these sections. The cutaways that replaced the stories, the characters who became single notes, the shock content that escalated past the point of meaning, the co-protagonist who disappeared while still on screen. The show runs because television in the streaming era rewards content libraries and brand recognition and passive viewing compatibility. It runs because Fox has had it on Sunday nights for so long that removing it would require actively deciding to do something different, and doing something different carries risk. It runs because MacFarlane's voice is still in the episodes, because Peter and Brian and Stewie still look the way they have always looked, because the theme song still plays at the beginning and triggers the same recognition in viewers who have been watching since they were 12 years old. It runs because familiarity is its own form of value, separate from quality, and Family Guy has accumulated more familiarity than almost any other animated show alive. What the early show accomplished was different from all of that. It earned its audience's attention rather than simply occupying their evenings. It built characters who felt real enough to grieve when they changed. It made jokes that people remembered not because they watched the clip 50 times on social media, but because the joke was genuinely good, and the moment it came from was genuinely alive. That show existed. It was real. The people who bought those DVDs in 2003 were not wrong about what they were buying. Understanding why that show is better than what replaced it is not just an exercise in nostalgia. It is an exercise in understanding what comedy can do when it is built correctly. From the characters out, from the story first, from a genuine belief that the audience deserves something more than content to have on in the background. The early show believed that. It showed that belief in every episode it made. And that belief, more than any specific joke or character or cutaway gag, is what made it worth watching then and worth remembering now. There is one piece of this story left to tell. Because everything in these 12 sections, the cancellation, the comeback, the lost characters, the structural collapse, the persistence despite all of it, points toward a single question that this essay has been building toward from the beginning. Not what happened to Family Guy, but what early Family Guy was actually doing that made it matter in the first place. What it was saying, underneath all the noise, about the specific time it came from and the specific audience it was speaking to. That is the question the conclusion needs to answer. And the answer, it turns out, is more interesting than anything the show has done in years. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.